Okay. I'll just wait a little bit for the live stream. Yeah. Obrigado. Vamos para a transmissão, né? Vai. Vai lá na transmissão. Tá, abre seu celular. Deixa eu abrir mais. É, tô fazendo chamada lá. Não chegou.
Esse
O dele. Vou ligar pra Rafa, pra ela lá no Expresso. É, 40 anos. Aqui? Tá bom, foi? Nada. Ô, Rafael, aqui, é o Frank de novo. O vídeo tá dando como privado aqui no canal. Você sobe aqui ou você vai mudar isso? Tá. Aham. Tá. Atualiza, por favor, Não, chegou. Tá, só carregando aqui a internet. Parece, agora sim, vamos ver. Tá, só carregando aqui a internet. Parece, agora sim, vamos ver. Tchau. Yeah. So, hello, good morning everyone. I'm Franklin, I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Minas Gerais. Very happy to have you all here and to have Professor Weichmann with us. It's a pleasure, it's an honor for all of us. Just to quick intro, so this semester we've read this beautiful book here, the middle one, and we had a chance to exchange our thoughts with Professor Weichmann, which already has some papers that he wrote on the subject, on his work actually, and he kindly accepted the invitation to come all the way down to Brazil to hear some thoughts of us. So we're very thankful for you, Professor, and for everyone here. So that's it. So that's why this event exists, and that's why we have you all here now. So thank you very much. We thought about starting the event with Professor Weichmann telling us a little bit about his background history, why he became a liberal, why he still won, and also, and I'm not sure if all of you are interested about it. I particularly am. I would like to hear a little bit about the process of writing this masterpiece and about the Professor John Rawls as the supervisor, his PhD thesis. So, Professor Weichmann, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction and for the invitation to come to Brazil. This is, as I have told a few of you, not only my first trip to Brazil, but my first to South America. And, though I just arrived yesterday, I've enjoyed it very much so far. I'm especially grateful for the tour of the city I got yesterday, the introduction to Brazilian cuisine, which was wonderful. particularly the Brazilian coffee, which was most welcome after a long flight from the States. So I thank you for everything you've done to make this happen and to make me feel so welcome. Franklin, as he told you, asked me to talk a little bit about the origins of my interest in Rawls and political liberalism, and I'm flattered that you want to hear about it. So I'll say a little bit. I started graduate school in Harvard in 1981 after I finished my undergraduate years at Notre Dame, the university where I now teach. And I'd been interested in politics all my life, and that led somewhat naturally to an interest in political philosophy. But I hadn't had much chance to study it as an undergraduate. No one at Notre Dame taught it, or at least taught it very systematically or very often. And so I didn't have any exposure to Rawls when I got to graduate school. And I had actually thought about working in a different area of philosophy altogether. And I was gradually drawn back to political philosophy as I took a couple of classes in it from Rawls. And yet my interest was not immediately drawn to his own work, though it probably should have been. Instead, I made the curious and perhaps ill-considered decision to write a dissertation on the political thought of Thomas Aquinas, about whom nobody at Harvard knew very much. But that's okay. They were still very encouraging. In retrospect, I think it was a missed opportunity not to work on something that was more centrally related to the interests of the people with whom I worked in graduate school. But I really wanted to learn something about Aquinas' thought and about Catholic social thought, and I thought this was the last chance I would have just to give myself time to study it. But if I didn't take this opportunity, I wouldn't. And John Rawls and Judith Sklar, who were my co-directors, were very encouraging, surprisingly encouraging. And the experience of working with both of them was really quite extraordinary. I don't know if the name Judith Sklar even means anything to people anymore. Some people may recognize it. But she was an emigre scholar. She left Riga, Latvia, in the late 1930s, grew up in Montreal, went to Harvard to do her doctoral work, and remained there to teach for the rest of her career. She was a really extraordinary person, not just because of the upbringing that she had while a member of a somewhat aristocratic family in Riga, of the quality of her mind, but also for her persistence. Being a female academic in political science in the 1950s was not an easy thing. Her mentor recognized her brilliance and arranged a teaching position for her, but there weren't then regular teaching positions for women, and she was raising children, so she lectured occasionally, and after some years, the department just made her a full professor. She was, I think, the first woman tenured in political science at Harvard. And she was really very forceful personality. If she lives on now in memory, it's much through her conversation, the impact of her conversation on people, rather than on her writing, though some of her writing is, I think, still read. The book on Rousseau, I think, is especially good. But anyway, she was very encouraging to me and very supportive, as was Rawls. And he was a wonderful person, an extraordinary person to work with, though in a different way than she was. She had a very quick mind. She was a forceful conversationalist. You did not walk out of the room wondering what she thought. He was much more guarded. I think by the time that I got to know him, he was already very famous, and I think he was very worried about exerting undue influence on people. And so he was a person of some natural reserve anyway, and not wanting to overwhelm students, but wanting to let them go their own way and enjoy their autonomy. He was a somewhat more distant director, supportive and encouraging, but also willing to let people largely direct themselves. And I thought it was it's quite a tribute to his personality when you think how he could have impacted students or tried to make people in his own image, that he decided not to do that. He was also, while a somewhat distant but conscientious advisor, he was an extraordinarily conscientious teacher. He put an awful lot of work into preparing his lectures. And if you've seen the collected lectures of his in the history of political philosophy and the history of moral philosophy that were published, you had some idea of just how much effort he put into preparing his teaching. He worked very hard on those lectures and then stood and delivered them roughly verbatim because he wanted to be sure that he had things exactly right. And the students wouldn't go wrong or be led astray by some offhand remark. So as I said, I worked on Aquinas in my dissertation. And yet my aim was always to contribute somehow to contemporary political philosophy. And as my dissertation was finishing up and my teaching career starting, I began to read more and more contemporary political philosophy. And in the end, never did very much with the medieval political philosophy that I studied. But what really made me familiar with Rawls's thought was having to teach it. The great mathematician John von Neumann said one time, you don't really understand a piece of mathematics until you've worked your way through 100 examples. I think you don't really understand a piece of philosophy until you have to teach it. And especially if you have to teach it to the kind of students I'm privileged to teach, very bright and curious students who will not let you get away with much if you make a mistake, and to whom you have to explain things really clearly. And so it was as much in an effort to get clear about Rawls for my teaching as anything that I really worked hard on his books. And the more I taught and worked on the books, the more I came to appreciate his theory and its structure, why he thought he had to redescribe his view as a political liberalism. And I became convinced in thinking about that a lot of people didn't really know why he had made the change, and that very few people accepted the explanation that he himself offered. And I started to think about what changes the redescription or representation of his view as a political liberalism entailed. And as a result of the work that I did on his books, I came away with a welter of maybe conflicting thoughts about Rawls's work. Robert Nozick says someplace that until you've read Rawls, you don't really appreciate how beautiful a philosophical theory can be. And I did put down theory of justice after working on it for so long. Put down the theory of justice with a pronounced aesthetic appreciation of the beauty of the theory. It really is a beautiful piece of philosophical work. And I also came to appreciate just how disciplined a thinker Rawls was. The book touches on a lot of subjects, and it's been applied to many more. But I really think that Rawls maintained a laser-like focus on a few problems that deeply concerned him, and that he was convinced he had to address to round out the theory and make it viable. And my sense of his discipline has only increased as more and more of his unpublished work has become available. It's clear that he knew a tremendous amount of philosophy, and knew a tremendous amount about a lot of other things too. And yet he resisted on publishing things that didn't have to do with the work of the project in which he was engaged. And I came away with a lot of respect for his intellectual discipline. I came especially to appreciate the part of theory of justice that few people read, part 3. And I don't know what's true here when people study Rawls, so I shouldn't say a lot of people don't read it. But in the States, reading Rawls's theory of justice is like reading Hobbes's Leviathan. You read the book until the contract gets written, and then you close it and you move on to something else. And in Hobbes's case, you've only made it through half the book. Now, my own opinion is that the second half is a bit weird. If you've ever read the second half of Leviathan. And yet Hobbes took pains over elaborating this version of Christianity, tried to locate or find scriptural bases for the arguments that he put forward in the first half of the book. He wasn't wasting his time in writing it, and we wouldn't be wasting our time in reading it, and yet few people do. And the same is true, I think, with the latter 2/3 of theory of justice. If you put down or close the book after the social contract is written and the principles are decided upon, you're going to miss an awful lot. And I think part 3, which Rawls once said is his favorite part, is especially interesting. And I think if I had to speculate on why, I'm going on too long, so.
No.
Okay. If I had to speculate on why that was his favorite part, I think he'd say it was the most original. That other people were talking about something like the original position. John Bressani, the Hungarian emigre economist, had something quite like the original position, at the same time Rawls was using it, he used his original position to defend utilitarianism rather than Rawls's view like Rawls's, but other people were talking about social contract theory, were talking about something like the original position. And so, while I think Rawls was proud of the first part, he thought that the third part of the book was the most original. And it was there that he tackled what he thought was the very big problem of how a just society, once in place, could remain stable. And in order to do that, he had, to talk about the moral sentiments, about moral learning, the thin and full theories of goodness, the good of justice. The question of whether it's good to be just is, as you know, one of the oldest problems in moral philosophy, and dating from at least the Republic. And Rawls thought he had an answer to it, at least for citizens in a good society, or just society. So in that part of the book, not only does he give innovative treatments of the moral sentiments and of moral learning, and synthesize a great deal of moral psychology, but he also tackles one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy on the side. I came to appreciate the Kantian interpretation of theory of justice, which I think is just wonderful, and which I'm told was a late addition to the book. People who saw it not long before it was published were really surprised at its addition, or so I'm told. I came to appreciate the really deep questions about the human condition that moved Rawls to write. And I confess that the textual evidence for those is rather thin. I was led to think about those more by an attempt to make sense of stray remarks that I heard him make, or stray remarks that were reported to me. A friend of mine in graduate school said he had this remarkable conversation with Rawls one day in which Rawls said, the really big question is whether human beings can be good. And I thought, you wouldn't get that from reading the book, but it's something that deeply concerned him. The remarks about reasonable faith that he makes in a couple of places, the remarks at the end of the introduction to political liberalism, all betray some of these concerns, but he was not a person given to self-revelation, particularly in print. And yet, I do think he had these very deep concerns. And I also have wondered how many political philosophers that's true. Rousseau and Kant, probably. Hobbes and Locke, I don't know. Certainly they wrote great works of political philosophy, but were they really moved by these kind of deep questions about the human condition and the possibility of human goodness? I don't know. It's awfully hard to tell from what they wrote. And more recently, again as a result of teaching Rawls to yet another cohort of students, I've come to appreciate how much he learned from Aristotle, or one might not think so. There is an Aristotelian principle that he refers to in theory of justice, but I think that's just the tip of what he learned from Aristotle. The thought that a good life consists in human activity, in the exercise of our fundamental capacities, is something I think he found in Aristotle and took over. And that, as Rawls says some places, that the highest activity, the highest use of an Aristotle and incorporated into his own work. And of course I came to appreciate how difficult it must have been for Rawls to make the changes he did in recasting his view from the presentation of theory of justice to a political liberalism, because much of, or at least some of what is powerful about the theory has to be given up or qualified. And it must have been very difficult for him to make those changes, and yet I do think he had to make them. I think what he says about our nature and its expression is just not, it's too controversial ever to be universally accepted, even in the kind of liberal society he envisioned. And so I think he was right to make the changes to political liberalism. And it's a mark of his tremendous honesty, I think, that he was willing to make them. Well, I think I'll stop on that note, and I'm happy to, we have questions about that, we can move to the first session. Whatever you would like to do is fine with me. I can't very well say less than I just did, but if you want me to say more, I can.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I'm just going to explain a little bit about the event, the dynamics we're going to have here. So as I told earlier, Professor Whiteman already has some papers that we wrote, and the first presentation will be Professor Leandro Zantelli, who will introduce Professor Whiteman's to all of us. Professor Zantelli, please. After the speech, Professor Whiteman will have a moment to give us his thought on the paper, and then we'll open the debate. So I would ask you guys to speak in English, but if not possible, you can speak in Portuguese, and I will try to translate. Professor, is that okay, Professor?
It's fine. I just apologize that I can't.
That's no problem.
Portuguese.
So if you want to speak Portuguese, that's okay. We'll give it a try. Okay, please, Professor.
So good morning. I'd like to thank Franklin for making this meeting possible, and also I'm profoundly grateful for Professor Whiteman accepting the invitation, and I also grateful for your book. Your book is really amazing. I'm sure that I've never understand roles as I understand now when I saw your book. I sometimes think if you don't understand roles better than roles. So during this semester, we worked on Professor Whiteman's book, and at the end of the semester, we wrote some papers. I wrote a paper asking a simple question. Well, if we accept Professor Whiteman's interpretation about the political term, how this changes, if some change occur, how this changes the conception of justice, Rawls' conception of justice, justice is fairness, and is there some change? And I wrote a tentative paper answering yes for this question. I will read some part of the paper for you, and we will. Yeah, is that? Okay. Rawls' political term and the ambitions of justice as fairness. Introduction. This article looks at the well-known issue about the softening of John Rawls' egalitarianism after the political shift, that is, after the transition from a theory of justice, PJ, to political liberalism, PL. But instead of dealing with the accusation that in PL the problem of justice is relegated to the background, the following considerations start from the careful reconstruction of Rawls' political term made by Paul Whiteman. Whiteman rejects the interpretation that Rawls' political transition had the implication of giving primacy to questions of legitimacy over questions of justice. On the contrary, Rawls' ambitions of the two phases are for Whiteman substantially the same, namely to defend justice as fairness as a more reasonable conception of justice and the stability inherent or for the right reasons of that conception under the favorable circumstances of a well-ordered society. From this perspective, the transition to PL would not be a change of course, but merely a response to difficulties that Rawls came to encounter in the stability argument presented in the third part of TJ. The thesis I intend to argue below is that if the problem of justice remains the central problem, the solution given to this problem in both phases of Rawls' work is not the same. In other words, I want to revive here the idea that the political transition has come at the cost of a smoothing of justice's fairness, though not because justice issues have been overshadowed by legitimacy. That in its political version, justice's fairness proves to be a less ambitious or radical conception of justice is, in my view, due to two maneuvers Rawls uses to correct what we saw as shortcomings in the argument of stability in TJ. The first of these maneuvers is to reformulate justice's fairness as a political conception of justice, restricted as such to the political realm, which entails subjecting the object of justice as fairness, the basic structure of society, to tighter limits than in TJ. The second maneuver is to make the original position build on the idea of citizens rather than persons, as free, equal, and rational. In this new version, the original position is insensitive to interests, not confined to the role of citizen, which implies, in turn, a review of the primary goods whose distribution the principles chosen in the original position are concerned. In particular, certain interests of citizens who are rational persons, such as the interest in social circumstances, under which certain pathologies of reason are less likely to occur, are set aside after the political term. The article is divided into three sections. The first section summarizes Rawls' political transition as described by Whiteman, paying particular attention to one of his arguments about stability in TJ, the Kantian Congress argument, and the consequences of abandoning this argument in PL. The other two sections present the thesis on the softening of justice's fairness in its political version. The second section deals with the object of justice's fairness, the basic structure of society, and the difficulties of widening that object after the political transition, while the third section deals with the reformulation of the original position and its implications for the primary goods of whose distribution justice's fairness is concerned. Well, as the first section is just a reproduction of some of Professor Whiteman's arguments, I will skip this part, so to save some time, and we go directly to the second section. Please feel free. So the boundaries of the political. We saw in the previous section part of the reasons that led Rawls to reformulate justice's fairness as a political conception of justice. In this section, I shall deal with the impact of this reformulation on justice's fairness, starting with its object. Although in PL, Rawls even envisions a well-ordered society according to a family of liberal conceptions of justice, justice's fairness continues to have a prominent place as the most reasonable of these conceptions. Aside from what the reformulation of justice's fairness as a political conception implies, for example, that the ideals of conduct and association that it embodies are now political rather than ethical ideals, there are no clear signs of change either in the object or in the content of this conception. With regard in particular to the object, justice's fairness is already presented in the TJ as a conception of justice for the basic structure of society. In PL, this apparently holds the same way. Its application to the basic structure, and only to the basic structure, is one of the characteristics Rawls attributes to political conceptions of justice, such as justice as fairness is now presented. My thesis is that, despite appearances, Rawls' political shift has implications for the object of his conception of justice. More precisely, that limit of what is called the basic structure of society solidifies in PA, thus moderating the revolutionary force of justice as fairness. To understand why, let's start with the object of justice as fairness in TJ. Rawls there states, as is well known, that justice as fairness is a conception of justice for the institutions that constitute what he designates as the basic structure of society. Let us remember that one of the ideas embodied in the original position is that of society as a fair scheme of cooperation. It's no more than natural then that deliberation in the original position be primarily about a conception of justice for social institutions, given the role in defining rights and distributing the advantages and burdens of social cooperation. The question of the precise limits of the subject matter of justice, of course, does not arise here. Knowing whether or not a particular law should pass the seal of justice is a question that philosophy inquiry, given its degree of abstraction, is usually unable to answer. The point is not whether the laws of TJ precisely define what belongs to the object of justice is fairness, but whether the theory, in its first formulation, had the resources to counteract a tendency to widen this object. To illustrate this expansionist tendency toward the enlargement of justice as fairness object, consider G.A. Cohen's critique of Rawls. Cohen accuses Rawls of incoherence in removing certain behaviors from the object of justice, in particular the decisions of talent citizens about the exercise of their talents. If these behaviors are beyond the object of justice because the basic structure of society is constituted only by coercive institutions, say Cohen, then this object is arbitrarily limited because non-coercive or informal institutions such as habits and attitudes can also considerably influence the distribution of the advantages and burdens of social cooperation. Think, for example, about the impact of gender stereotypes. If, on the contrary, the institutions of the basic structure are both coercive and non-coercive institutions, then one must consider how to prevent the claims of justice as fairness from failing on individual behaviors and not only on state action, since it is thanks to these behaviors that informal institutions perpetuate themselves. How could the laws of TGA counteract the expansionist tendency? Aside from the caveat admitted by Cohen himself that the claims of justice cannot go as far as reducing citizens to slaves of justice, which would be contrary to the very interests that guide the deliberation in the original position, it does not appear that in its earlier non-political version, justice as fairness can resist a significant widening of its object. Consider two arguments of Samuel Schaeffer in this regard. First, Schaeffer attributes the limits of the object of justice as fairness to a certain methodological modesty by Rawls. As principles suited to certain objects may prove inadequate to others, that the principles of justice as fairness have their application restricted to certain institutions is justified by the doubt that these principles are appropriate to deal with other issues, such as the family and the associative activities. This argument fails, however, in treating the principles of justice as fairness as given. Deliberation in the original position is about principles for regulating the terms of social cooperation. Now, if family life and associative activities are part of those terms, and the principles of justice as fairness, for example, the difference principle, are not adequate to regulate them, then it's right to revise the conception of justice, for example, by adding other principles, so that it is able to regulate the whole terms of cooperation, rather than shortening off those terms so that justice's fairness remains untouched. Second, Scheffler also claims it's not arbitrary to restrict the object of justice's fairness to coercive institutions. After all, he says there's something special about these institutions, which is precisely that they are coercive. Thus, the formal and informal institutions have in common their influence on the distribution of the benefits of social cooperation. The former differ from the latter because they are constituted by state action backed by the threat of sanctions. Given this difference, it's not arbitrary that a conception of justice is concerned only with coercive institutions. The second argument, however, does not match the role of a conception of justice for laws, which is to regulate the terms of social cooperation, not the coercive action of the state. It is, moreover, an argument incongruous with the role, no more than secondary, that sanctions must play in a society in which justice's fairness is an inherently stable conception of justice. The failure of Scheffler's arguments illustrates the difficulty of confining the object of justice's fairness in TJ. Things change, however, with the reformulation of justice's fairness as a political conception of justice. Not coincidentally, object constraint is, as we have seen, one of the characteristics draws impulse to a political conception. In PL, justice's fairness has a restricted object, therefore, by virtue of presenting itself as a political conception of justice. But what makes object restriction essential to a political conception? We saw in the previous section that in PL, the stability of justice's fairness is achieved through an overlapping consensus of comprehensive doctrines. This consensus has as its object justice's fairness, a family of liberal conceptions of justice, and makes every citizen, from his comprehensive doctrine, want to honor the political ideals that justice's fairness expresses. But under the pluralism that the conception of the person as free, equal, and rational, found in the tradition of democratic societies and confirmed by the public conception of justice, the pluralism that the conception of the person as free, equal, and rational found in the tradition of democratic society engenders, this overlapping consensus can only be expected for a conception of justice that is itself and the ideals it covers limited to the domain of the political. In PL, therefore, the solution to the problem of stability depends on justice's fairness in a conception of justice with an object restricted to the basic rights of citizenship and the basic terms of social cooperation. This does not mean, of course, that the limits of the political are precisely delineated, not that justice should only concern itself with coercive institutions. What Rawls' political term implies for the object of justice's fairness, the basic structure of society, is that the expansionist tendency encounters a powerful obstacle, because the plausibility of an overlapping consensus diminishes as the limits of the political are widened. Consider, for example, the case of a comprehensive religious doctrine. In order to be in overlapping consensus, this doctrine must affirm, at least for the political domain, the precedence of political values, the value of the public conception of justice, over other values. This will be all the more difficult to do, however, as the political realm broadens to encompass such issues as the division of domestic labor and child rearing, because such enlargement must sharpen tension between political values and the non-political values professed by the comprehensive doctrine in question. The conclusion, then, is that the transition to political liberalism brings with itself a softening of justice's fairness. This effect, according to the argument presented in this section, is not related to the content of Rawls' conception of justice, but to its scope. While in the non-political version, Rawls' theory of justice has few resources to counter a trend toward the expansion of the concept of society's basic structure. The Rawls of PL depends on justice's fairness being strictly confined to the limits of the political, so that one part of the stability argument, the one that now involves an overlapping consensus of comprehensive doctrines, succeeds. There is, therefore, in PL, a ponderable reason why the object of justice's fairness cannot expand too much. 3. The primary goods of a political conception. I am also skipping the footnotes. In this last section, I would like to argue that the political transition also implies a change of content for justice's fairness, a change related to the goods whose distribution this conception of justice is concerned with, what Rawls calls primary goods. Let's start with a quick tour on these goods. The principles of justice's fairness are principles regulating the terms of social cooperation. Given the condition of finality to which deliberation in the original position is submitted, these principles are, as seen above, the last resort of appeal, the ultimate principles on the basis of which citizens of a well-ordered society, as participants in a scheme of cooperation, make their claims to each other. In addition to being ultimately anchored in such principles, citizens' claims are claims about the distribution of primary goods. It's so inappropriate for our society well-ordered by justice's fairness that citizens make claims to each other based on principles different from that conception, such as the principle of natural aristocracy, as they make claims about the distribution of goods, such as physical beauty, other than primary goods. Thus, just as important in the original position as the definition of principles is the definition of goods, the primary goods whose distribution is to be regulated by those principles. A formal condition for a good to be treated as a primary good is that claims about the distribution of that good can be arbitrated. Goods whose distribution is very difficult to measure, such as, for example, the joy of living, do not meet this condition. Aside from these, primary goods are goods that can be recognized as such in the original position, goods that serve the interests of citizens, as in the original position those interests are conceived. Remember that in 2J, the original position is built on a certain conception of the person as free, equal, and rational. Primary goods, such as freedoms, opportunities, wealth, and income, are therefore goods that fulfill the interests of citizens conceived as free, equal, and rational people. In view of the way in which primary goods are designated, a change in the index of these goods, and consequently in the content of the claims that the citizens of a well-ordered society address each other, distinguished from the way the original position is constructed after Rawls' political term. We saw in the first section that the failure of the stability argument in TJ leads Rawls to claim that the original position expresses a conception of citizen and no longer person as free, equal, and rational. It's worth returning to what, according to Whiteman, is behind this change. As stated earlier, the stability of justice's fairness in TJ is achieved in part by the force of certain ethical ideals that this conception of justice instills in the citizens of a well-ordered society. It's Rawls' disillusionment with these characters of justice's fairness, which makes it a comprehensive doctrine that leads, according to Whiteman, rationalism to the transition to political liberalism. In this political version, the ideals combined by Justice's fans are also political ideals that is confined to the limits of the political. Well, what determines this moderation of Justice's fans' ambitions as a political conception of justice is precisely the fact that in the well-ordered society of PA, what's part of the public justification of the principles of justice is a version of the original position that incorporates a conception of citizens rather than persons. Citizens of the well-ordered society of PA are led to ascend their sense of justice in the strict realms of politics, in part to honor their self-conception of citizens as free, equal, and rational who, as such, submit to the principles chosen under certain circumstances. The circumstances of the original position in which such self-conception plays a decisive role. An original position built on a conception of the person as free, equal, and rational shelters the interests of persons so conceived. Similarly, in the original position of PL, the interests that guide the deliberation of the parties are the interests of citizens, conceived as free, equal, and rational. The difference is considerable because the interests relevant to the choice of principles in the political version of the original position are the interests of citizens as such, and thus confined to the realm of the political. Besides restricting the object of Justice's fairness, the transition to political liberalism also has implications, therefore, for the index of primary goods whose distribution is regulated by this concept of justice. One of these implications is that interests stemming from certain robust conceptions of rationality, conceptions not confined to the political realm, must be set aside. Consider, for example, the problem of alienation as described by Heil Jäger. Jäger's conception of alienation distinguishes itself from not being tied to any substantive view of the good. As such, the interest in social conditions under which alienated relationships are less likely to surface is an interest that the parties in the original position may have in view without assuming a particular conception of the good. The parties may look at this interest, in other words, simply as what they are, representatives of rational persons. In PL, what precludes interests linked to more robust, but nevertheless formal views of rationality, such as the eggs, from being considered, is, as has been said, the narrowness of political boundaries. As representatives of free, equal, and rational citizens, the parties in the original position are limited to the interests of citizens as such. These interests are limited to the political domain, that is, they are the interests of people who, as participants in a scheme of cooperation, but not necessarily in their whole life, see themselves as free, equal, and rational, and as such, are willing to cooperate on terms consistent with this self-perception. Pathologies of reason that transcend this domain, for example, that afflict citizens in their work or family life, must remain oblivious to the index of primary goods and consequently to the choice of principles in the original position. Conclusion. Although Whiteman is right to reject the interpretation that problems of justice take a backseat in PA, and that the project of TJ to argue for the stability of justice's fairness has remained substantially the same after the political term, Rawls' transition to political liberalism takes place at the cost of a softening of justice's fairness. In its political version, justice's fairness is a milder conception of justice, in the first place because political liberalism provides a reason, one that was lacking in TJ, for the object of this conception of justice, the basic structures of society, do not stand to the intimate parts of social relations, for example, to the emphasis that Hoyle has in mind. As a political conception of justice, justice as facts is also subject to the criticism that Axel Honneth makes, in my view wrongly, to liberal theories of justice in general, namely that these theories are insufficient to comprehend an array of social pathologies that are widespread in contemporary life and best understood as various forms of estrangement from self, meaninglessness, indifference to the world, the inability to identify with one's own desires and actions, bifurcation of the self. Contrary to what Honneth implies, Justice's sense of TGA is sensitive to these pathologies, in view of the conception of person from which the original position is constructed. Only in the political version, with the narrowing of the interests on which the choice of principles take place, are such more robust, albeit untied to substantive views of the good conceptions of rationality set aside. The conclusion, therefore, is that we are faced with a dilemma. We have to choose, apparently, between a more ambitious version of justice's fairness and the commitment to stability inherent of all the right reasons, with the limits that this commitment brings with it. Attempting and possible, well, I don't know if it's possible, way out would be to go back to PGA to argue on new grounds for the stability of a non-political, radical version of justice as facts.
Before going further, I'm sorry that I'm so excited with the event. I'm a terrible host. I didn't properly introduce Professor Zantelli and Professor Whiteman. Is that necessary? I think so. But I would just like to say that Professor Whiteman is Dean Family Honors Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Notre Dame, and that I would like to personally thank the Dean Family Honors Program for supporting the Hero Plane ticket to come here. So thank you very much, Professor Zantelli, Professor here at the University of Minas Gerais. So yeah, I think that's covered. So please, Professor Whiteman.
Okay, I'll try not to take too long because I'm sure that a lot of people want to get in. I'm very grateful for the careful exposition of my work that was in the section that wasn't read. I'm very grateful for the attention that was put into it. So in the response, I'm going to focus on the third section, or at least I will begin with the third section, and then say a little bit at the end about the second section, which I see as connected to the third. So just to recap, as I understand the argument of the third section is roughly this, that once Rawls makes the political turn and decides that the original position should represent not our capacity of moral persons, as he said in Theory of Justice, but instead our fundamental capacities as citizens, then the interests of persons as represented in the original position has to be, some interests of persons as represented in the original position have to be set aside, and among those are interests in avoiding various pathologies of reason, including the estrangement from self, meaninglessness, and indifference to the world that Axel Honneth is said to focus on or said to be concerned with. And I'll say parenthetically, as I was saying in discussion before the session, that this will be a nice opportunity for me to learn about Honneth, about whom I don't know very much, about whom I wish I knew more. But to return to the pathologies of reason that are said to be of concern to Honneth, the estrangement from self, meaninglessness, and indifference to the world, so prevalent in modern life. I do think, though this doesn't come through explicitly in Rawls's work, that I do think any socially attuned political theorist has to be concerned with roughly those things, and that a lot of socially concerned and socially attuned political theorists are, including Rawls, so we'll get to that in a second, but that they differ greatly in their diagnosis. So some people, like my erstwhile departmental colleague Alistair McIntyre, think that modernity itself is to blame, that we're going to be alienated from ourselves and life will be meaningless because a good human life just cannot be lived in large, anonymous, modern, industrial societies of the sort with which we're familiar. A good life can only be lived in a society on the scale that Aristotle imagined. Some people, again, like McIntyre, perhaps like Michael Sandel, or like my colleague at Notre Dame in the political science department, Patrick Deneen, blame the lack of moral consensus or religious consensus for these various pathologies of reason, and think that they can be overcome only if societies are united on some moral conception of the good, or perhaps in some religious conception. Rawls is a theorist of distributive justice, and so you might think that he thereby cuts off a concern with these pathologies of reason, and yet I think he doesn't fit as comfortably as you might initially seem to into the category theorist of distributive justice, and that's because the point of justice, as he understands it, or so I believe, is that we are to live with one another as free equals, and in order to do that, well, justice has to be conceived somewhat more broadly than distributive justice often is. I'll say that again in a second. But I might note parenthetically that, well, I don't know what is true of political philosophy here. In the States, what's come to be called relational egalitarianism enjoys considerable currency. And the point of relational egalitarianism, as I understand it, is that the real point of equality is not the equal distribution of resources, but the leveling of hierarchies, and that people should relate to one another as equals. And though a lot of interesting work has been done in relational egalitarianism, my view is that what the relational egalitarians have done is rediscover what Rawls knew and what Rawls was driving at all along, which is that the real point of justice is for us to live together as free equals. And I think Rawls, some indication that Rawls is there are a number of indications that Rawls is concerned with this, but one is that he thinks that parties in the original position, both in the early version of his work and the later one, have an interest in the providing the social bases of self-respect. And however the social bases of self-respect get spelled out, they're not exactly the sorts of things that can be distributed, or at least so I believe, not distributed in the way that income and wealth can be distributed, say. And if we take that part of Rawls's work very seriously, that he's concerned with the provision of social bases of self-respect, then I think he doesn't fit as comfortably into the pigeonhole theorist of distributive justice as he might initially seem. And even if he's primarily concerned with distributive justice, its real point is to achieve social relations of a certain kind, relations between free and equals. So a society in which we can live as free equals has to be a society of mutual respect. And I think Rawls's hope is that a society in which the demands of justice are met, the bases of social respect, self-respect are provided, in which education is adequate to equality of opportunity, as it plainly is not, at least in the contemporary United States. And access to elite education varies greatly by income. A society that realized fair equality of opportunity in Rawls's sense would have to address that. A society that achieved or that satisfied the difference principle. A society that did all these things, satisfied the demands of justice, guaranteed the fair value of political liberties, provided the social basis of self-respect, satisfied fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle. And I think Rawls's hope was that in a society of that kind, people would be free to find meaning in their own way. Makes it a liberal view. But I think he believed that in such a society, he hoped that people in such a society would achieve or would pursue conceptions of the good that aren't vacuous, but that we intuitively recognize as full of meaning and endowing life with purpose, and that alienation would largely be absent. Now this is, of course, a very strong and optimistic claim. It depends on some of the moral psychology that Rawls endorses in Part 3 of Justice, or Part 3 of Theory of Justice. And I do think it depends upon people's attaching a lot of weight or importance to their status as free and equal citizens. I think people have to regard that as a very important thing if they're to have the kind of self-respect, enjoy the kind of self-respect that Rawls thought citizens in a just society would. And we might think Rawls was too optimistic about that. Maybe in a society that realized the demands of justice, people would still choose kind of vapid, consumeristic lives that many social theorists worry about. But I think Rawls really had enough optimism about human beings to think that that was not so. So he does have this very strong and optimistic view about the kind of lives people will choose under just conditions. I'm not convinced that that's a claim he stakes just in political liberalism. I think it might also be in theory of justice as well. And so I think it's there too. And so I'm not sure that the interests that rational persons as such have in overcoming alienation, say, I'm not sure that that fits any better into the original position of theory of justice than it does into the theory of justice of political liberalism. Because I think there are lots of reasons why Rawls thought parties had an interest in the primary goods, or why he stipulated that they have an interest in the primary goods. But one is that the primary goods are the sorts of things that are under the control of the basic structure of society. And so this is where I see the connection between the second and third parts of the paper, that it's because Rawls makes the basic structure primary and concerns himself with the adequate distribution of the things under its control, that he might, both early and late, have bridled at the thought that parties in the original position should be concerned with many of the pathologies of reason just as such. And so that's a first cut of the answer. I don't know if you want to respond to that, or if you want to throw it open, or if it was unclear and I should just say
I think it's clear from the cover a little bit, right? So, any notes, any comments? Okay.
It really ought to be striking that Rawls thinks that Rawls has such faith in people's choosing, in the claim that people will choose conceptions of the good that we all regard as meaningful, and alienation can be overcome if distributive justice or justice is achieved. I mean, you might remember, if you've gotten to the third part of theory of justice, that he there endorses a principle called the Aristotelian principle, which is roughly that people, if given adequate opportunity, will prefer more complex activities rather than less. And you might think that's really not true. He provides some evidence for it. But you might think, that's certainly not true. People don't prefer chess to checkers, or calculus to arithmetic, or sophisticated analyses of football to vapid analyses of football. But I think Rawls counts on the Aristotelian principle doing an awful lot of work in ensuring that people will choose conceptions of the good that we intuitively regard as worthwhile. Without, if the principle is right, then he can avoid making controversial claims about what ways of life are or not worthwhile. As a matter of fact, people will just choose them. Sorry, you were going to say.
No, I wasn't. Actually, I just think that regarding part of the scope of Professor Zanetti's argument, I believe that the fair value of the political liberties might also be the trick of avoiding these softening of totalitarianism in Rawls after Rawls' political term. That's only an intuition. We've talked about it a little bit earlier.
Do you want to say more about that? I would like to hear more about that argument.
No, it's just because I think that that's a core point of his argument, that once we have the political turn, then we have softening of the egalitarian part of the theory, the egalitarian character of the theory, and that's because once we have the political turn, there's only less things that we can we have to restrict the basic structure to political institutions, and we have to make it more, more adequate to But I think that even after the political turn, the fair value of the political liberties is also sustained, and that it would avoid the, for instance, alienation problem, because you have to give them the status as citizens, as free and equal citizens, to be part of the society, and they cannot be avoided of the material means to do so. And I'm not sure how to. I think part of alienation is a part of
There are other
interests.
problems. The scope of the basic structure is important to define if you can lead or not with feminist issues. And, I don't know how the fair value of political liberties will help in that.
So
Maybe could you develop some relation with ideal theory? Maybe aren't you trying to differentiate some levels of idealization? I don't know if you have this in mind. And maybe the differences in higher order interests.
Those pathologies of reason could belong to non-ideal theory, is that? It depends on how you define ideal theory. If you think on ideal theory as the theory of a well-ordered society, if the social basis of I didn't write, but I did think when writing the paper in the social basis of self-respect, and I didn't want to enter in the topic, but I think something as the social basis of non-alienation or a painful life. If you include something like that in the index of primary goods, you are dealing with the problem in ideal terms. You have the resources in ideal theory to prevent those problems.
And we can't, just to express agreement with you, we can't just assume that an ideal society would lack those problems. I mean, suppose it turned out that realizing the difference principle was compatible with neoliberal consumer capitalism. Then you might think, even in an ideal society, these problems will be occur. So you need some argument that they won't. You can't just say, well, it's an ideal society, so they won't.
It's a question on how optimistic we are.
Yeah, and what the causes of these things are, right? And as I said, I don't know as much about Hannah as I would like, but those of you who do, what does Hannah think causes these social pathologies? What is it about modern life that gives rise to? I just don't know, but I would be interested in hearing. I know at least a couple of you know a lot about Hannah.
Yeah. I'm trying to work with this. I think that there's space for interesting exchange between critical theory and Rawls, political liberalism.
Yes, please.
In more recent works, Axel Hahn has admitted that John Rawls was correct. That it's possible, just with the works of Rawls, to deal with the problems that interest to Axel Hahn. So today, it's difficult to view where is the point of critical. that Axel Hunt point to Rawls' work.
Okay.
Okay, and there is a work that has been translated to Portuguese, in which he asserts that we can, with Rawls' work, do much more than the liberal tradition has done.
And what led to this change of mind? What made him come to think that you could do everything with Rawls? And maybe other people disagree with this interpretation.
Okay. Well, to me, the point is there is a lack of social theory in the base of the liberal tradition. But it's not a problem if we comprehend the methodological restrictions of the liberal tradition. So I think that it's possible to approximate the liberal tradition and the critical theory if we comprehend that there are different objectives. Okay, critical social theory don't aim at offer propositions to make the society a better society. Critical social theory and to present what are the problems of society. To me, liberal tradition aims at present some proposal of a better society. And if we comprehend that difference, it's possible to approximate. But to do this approximation, it's necessary to do some methodological steps. And one of these steps is the social theory in the base of the liberal tradition conceptions. Okay, so the problem of the stability. Why is this so important for the liberal tradition? I mean, what? Yes. I mean, to us.
You asked it the right person.
To us, for social theory, we ever had known that our position, our conception of society, is not a conception that could be accepted for the all of person. To us, okay, our conception of society is a conception of society that is difficult to be accepted for all persons. We have a dream. We have a proposal of a future. And to me, the view of society of the liberal tradition is something like this. Okay, it's a view of society, it's a conception of society, and it has to confront itself with a lot of others.
I've seen a couple of people with hands up, but you've probably been keeping better track than I have. I know you did, but I don't know who else. So,
Just a second, you're done with the question, I'd like to develop a little bit further. Quer falar um pouquinho?
No.
Okay, thank you. So my thoughts are that we make a longer first session, that we take some more questions, and probably this morning session with only 2 debaters, so that we can benefit from the minds here and what they think.
that sounds fine. I'm certainly benefiting.
Yeah. So
I don't know that they are.
Would you like to tell the very nice guy over there why stability matters?
I would like to ask a question. Just to add.
Is this
Oh,
related?
sure. I would like to add something that what he just said.
Is that okay? Is that all related?
No, my question is.
It's not related, so let's, please.
Yes, mine is. Answering what you asked Professor about Honnet, I'm not so deeply concerned about Honnet as a philosopher, which he doesn't claim he is. But anyway, I think that in his first articles and in one of his books, he said that there are some issues, and there is a very famous paper here in Brazil. I don't know that it's before what you said of his change of his mind. That it's a paper that he wrote with a professor called Joel Anderson, and he claims, and he goes with like 3 arguments against the idea of the liberal society, and one of the arguments is deals with the idea that Rawls does not, or the liberal tradition based on Kantian heritage, does not use the idea of social relationship, mainly when he deals with the idea of the self-esteem or self-respect. Then I think we can ask, we can actually ask Honnet at that moment if he read the part of the TJ that you mentioned, the third part, because in that part we can have the answers for that. But at the same time, I would like to say that I agree with the idea of your book that a reform was needed to be done, because otherwise the theory would not be applicable. It would be like a very ideal theory, and the theory would be also a comprehensive doctrine, as he says when he writes the LP, the PL actually, because that was taken in Portuguese. But anyway, and just to add to what our colleague said, the idea that the stability is of crucial importance, reading your book and actually Rawls' liberal, political liberalism, is that without it, we don't have a theory that can be applicable, that can be like feasible. It's just going, and his effort in that moment is, it's going to be feasible. And I think that Honnet should have changed his way of looking at the liberal tradition and Kantian tradition, because I think that there are lots of moments in the third part of TJ that can answer all of his critics, at least in the paper. I'm not familiar with the later work that he wrote, that you mentioned, but I think that that was a good way that he did, because even in that paper, his remarks against Rawls is very, and he acknowledged that is very, very subtle, and he just wants to add some extra points to PJ and PL.
Okay. That's very helpful. Just a follow-up question about the claim about the liberal tradition and its lack of a social theory. I mean, that can't be true of Rousseau, right? However, I mean, Rousseau's social theory might be limited, but it's hard to read a discourse on the origins of inequality and come away thinking he's not concerned with the origins of social pathology. And I know less about Mill, but I suppose some of Mill's work maybe is concerned with the subjugation of women, for example, concerned with the origins of certain pathologies. But Rousseau must have been deeply concerned with these problems, even if you don't get long tracts about them. So I assume Hunt would make an exception for that case. And even Hobbes gives a story about the origins of the conflicts that he thinks are the most pressing threat to the societies of his time. You might think that the analysis is wrong, but it seems to be there. But I don't know if I would acknowledge that or push back. It'd be interesting to know.
Okay, let's hear some Jason, please.
First, congratulations for your article and for your work. My question is, in the first version of political liberalism, Rawls did account of public reason that he, in the last version, he changed the open wide more. And my question is, if he starts change in theory of justice, but in the first PL version he didn't get yet, and he did this one, this last one. My question is, sorry for my English. What do you think that Rawls could do before he changed his view about the public reason? Because political liberalism has a lot of bases, of like consensus. It's a normative view. It's not just to identify problems, but to create a more well-ordered society. But in your view, what could be the next step of Rawls if he could continue writing about political reason, for example, or that consensus?
Yeah, that's
Professor, I'd just like to add to that question,
Sure.
if I may.
Sure.
Because there's that letter that Rawls wrote to his editor, to Anne, I believe, in which he said that he would like to review political liberalism as a whole. So taking your question, what's your best guess? I mean, after the idea of publicism revisited, he mentioned that he would like to still make some changes. That's like, feel free not to answer that if you don't think that's...
Oh, sure. Well, sure. I will. And then I'd be interested in what other people think people read Rawls do. Where you think he should have gone or could have gone if he had another 15 or 20. If he lived to be as old as time, say, and worked as long as time. Sorry?
Another restatement.
Yes, another restatement. Yes, or if he lived, Hobbes lived to be something like 95, right? If he lived to be as old as Hobbes, what would he have done? He would not have done what Locke did in his latter years. I think Locke spent his last years writing commentaries on the Gospels. I don't think Rawls would have done that. But I think he was satisfied in the end with his treatment of public reason. I think he probably would have liked to say even more about international justice than he did in Law of Peoples. And to respond to some of the critiques of Law of Peoples. I actually quite like Law of Peoples. I can understand why people criticize it. I think there are responses to the criticisms that could be made, but I would like to have heard what Rawls had to say about those. I don't know, people encountered Law of Peoples, but it's a treatment of international justice. And it's not a treatment of global justice, it really is a treatment of international justice. That is, Rawls is interested in that book in what the foreign policy of a just liberal society should be. And I think he would have liked to work that out in greater detail. I think another thing he would have liked to work out in greater detail is what economic arrangements are necessary for realizing the difference principle. Because even in the last works that he published, he said that either democratic socialism or property-owning democracy, or what he called property-owning democracy, were necessary to realize the difference principle. And it would have been very interesting to hear what more he had to say about those.
Can I add?
First?
Sure.
Ryan Barry has an article, Rawls and the Search of Stability, and he critiqued this aim for migrate the focus to the people of faith question. And the point of Barry is that Rawls forget the problem of the different the principle of difference. And he claimed that his new account of political liberalism is kind of, he assumes that justice and fairness is another view, Abrahamian view, but political liberalism in itself, it's a kind of natural one that can describe how the society can be better. I don't know. I know because of your book, but I want to hear you more about this critique about the difference principle and this aim of to construct a new theory to accommodate people of faith as a maybe neutral theory.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. I don't think that Rawls, whatever other softening of justice as fairness there may be, and I do take the point that certain feminist critiques of Rawls have to be addressed. I think that's absolutely right, and people have tried to address them. And it may be that the shift to political liberalism resulted in this softening that made those problems more urgent or harder to confront. Okay. So there might be some kinds of equality or egalitarianism, egalitarian demands that Rawls has a harder time meeting after the shift to political liberalism, perhaps. I don't think, though, whatever other softenings there may be, that he gave up on the difference principle or weakened it. I think he just didn't go back to it because he thought it was right. And yet what did worry him, I think, was that a free society is going to be a society in which there are lots of conceptions of the good, prominently, at least in the US, including a variety of religious conceptions of the good, and that people with other conceptions of the good than Rawls' own might have a very hard time accepting what he said about our nature and its expression. So a lot of the critical arguments that is the crucial arguments, the most important arguments that Rawls offered for why people in a well-ordered society would find it good to be just, turn on claims about expressing our nature and about what our nature is. And the idea that it's just our nature that is, it's human nature to seek a wide variety of conceptions of the good, and that our nature is really best expressed by doing that within constraints of principles of justice, is, I think, something he came to worry that religious people were one prominent group that would reject that. If you really think that human beings are made for God and that that's where we find fulfillment, then what Rawls says about our nature and its expression is not going to get much traction with you. So there better be some other story to tell about why religious people would find it good to be just. Does that get at your question? Okay.
Okay, so I think we can go on, right? Thank you, Professor Zanatelli. And I will call Professor Duncan-Rocha, please. So, Professor Duncan-Rocha holds a PhD in law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais, also a master's in law at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, is a specialist in public management, and a bachelor's in law at the Federal University of Ouro Preto. He's also a professor of law at the Federal University of Ouro Preto in both undergraduate and graduate program of law, and also a founding partner of our Management Association, which Professor Zanatelli is currently the president. So, Professor Bruno, would you like me to?
Yes, sure.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation, Professor Franklin, and especially Professor Zanatelli, my colleagues, Professor Mario, my colleague of University Federal of Ouro Preto. Good morning, Professor Weitman. It's a pleasure to be divided this board with you. I didn't participate this intense debate into the discipline taught by Professor Leandro. So, because he and his students are so generous, they shared with me the book and the papers and a lot of arguments about the discussion, and I'm so glad because of this. And I wrote not a kind of paper, but just some first ideas after that I had a contact with the Weitman's book, Weitman's argument. And I'm trying here to present some my little ideas that I have about Rawls' perspective, and to articulate with the Weitman's ideas. And I think that it's a good opportunity to test my point of view. Okay? Liberalism is a kind of concept that has a lot of means in social debates. As Professor Weitman points out, quote, there are by now a number of theories that qualify as political liberalism, close. Those means depend on the participants and the context of discussion, and at the same time, they should be articulated with some other ideas. For instance, the markets, the state, the individual rights, and especially the relation between the concept of person and public power, when we are considering both the possibility to use the coercion into the society and the distributive system of justice. Although those possibilities, I think that liberty is the principal idea when we will discuss liberalism. That is, liberty has been the most important concept in the modern society, as we have learned since Constant. Depending on the social context, the idea of liberty will be articulated with different content, and this possibility can provide a lot of sort of understanding about the principle into society, that principle into society. According to Kant's constructivism, we can claim that liberty is the most important normative concept in the human realm of ends. In that perspective, I think that the Rawlsian political liberalism can help us to think about the normative justification when we need to think about the principles of justice that should regulate our society. According to Professor Weitman, quote, Rawls wanted to identify basic terms of social cooperation that would be fair and collective rational. Close. I think that political liberalism is an important effort to develop some ideas that are already being present in the theory of justice. So that effort should try to articulate the concept of justice with the concept of fairness. And according to Professor Professor Waithman, quote, Rawls argued that TJ and continued to believe in PL that justice as fairness would be stable only if citizens in a well-ordered society developed a sense of justice. Close. Considering the constitutional democracy system, the citizen's sense of justice requires the principle of legitimacy and the idea of the public reason to provide a kind of public justification for the concept of justice. Thinking about the legitimacy and at the same time about the using of reasons into the public sphere is a kind of activity that should be produced by rational and reasonable persons according to their desires into the liberal modern system. This perspective is agreed with Altman's argument, quote, the Rawls of PL thinks that the stability of justice as fairness depends crucially upon the fact that its political ideal develop and specific ideas found in the tradition of liberal democratic thought. Close. I would like to explicit my point of view, that is, I think that Rawlsian thought can help us to think about which terms we can have a fair society. I accept in comprehensive sense that the principle of legitimacy and public reason present by Rawls in political liberalism can give to person the necessary support to reflect on the terms of cooperation into our society, as claimed in the theory of justice. This argument has some conditions to work well, and one of them is a society that is organized by the rule of law into the tradition of the constitutional democracy. Here I cannot delete the critics of Rawls' theory has received throughout the time. I just claim that Rawlsian sketch of the political problem of society works well if we consider the constitutional democracy. Nonetheless, I would like to highlight one aspect in terms of application that principal elements of that theory of justice. I would like to do it because of two reasons. First, we should consider a lot of problems when we think about the difference in the social context between American and Brazilian society. We knew that both countries have a rule of law, and we learned in the constitutional history how much the Brazilian constitutional law was influenced by American constitutional law. However, considering that we, Brazilian society, have an unfair society, especially in terms of social distribution, social justice distribution, I always put by myself this question: how can Rawlsian thought help us, Brazilian citizens or persons, to think in terms of cooperation in our society? Secondly, nowadays, Brazil has a fierce dispute in the public sphere about several terms and concepts, and one of them is the concept of liberalism. Some critics has pointed out that the fundamental liberal rights are inadequate because they are based on the human as atomistic individual. Others say that liberalism is just a theoretical tool to reproduce the capitalism as an unfair system of production. Sometimes to say that someone is a liberal person is a quite to insult people. But although I cannot demonstrate this complex debate here, I believe that both critics are a mistake when we think about the possibilities of political liberalism. I believe that Rawlsian concept of justice, especially the principle of legitimacy and public reason, can help us to think about how we can have a fair society as well-ordered society into the constitutional democracy tradition. So, considering those elements and also consider the why political liberalism arguments, my first point that I would like to present to Professor Waithman is consider the argument of the stability of society in honor to my colleague of David. especially the political idea of the justice as fairness, plus the principles of legitimacy and public reason, I would like to ask, despite the difference between the social context, can we apply this argument to other societies that have a rule of law? And how much does this perspective depend on the well-ordered society in order to have a minimal success as a theoretical effort? Finally, in the Whiteman's book, we find this claim, quote, "The Rawls became satisfied with TJ's treatment of stability because TJ failed to show that members of the well-ordered society would out-judge in good to preserve their firm goodwill." Close. Answering this claim, the pivotal argument assumes the importance into the argumentation, especially when Professor Whiteman invited the readers to consider that this argument could help to understand the path from TJ to EL. After a long argumentation, Professor Whiteman says that the pivotal argument established, quote, C1, the distribution of primary goods by the basic structure must be governed by the two principles, close. I would like to explore a little more this perspective, and I ask, can the pivotal argument be understood just as the context to pass from TJ to PL, or it can be understood as a defense of both principles of justice in the specific context of the theory of justice? So I hope these general questions would not be inappropriate when you think the context of the interpretation of the Rosian theory presented in your book. They are just my little contribution to this important debate, and again, thank you for this invitation and this great opportunity to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say a couple of things in response to some of the questions that were raised. One is about whether Rawls's argument can be applied to other societies that have the rule of law. And that is, I think, a very important question. And I guess my first reaction is that, well, much depends upon what one means by the rule of law. Just the rule of law, understood as the impartial application of statutes that are on the books, isn't quite enough. That is, the justice's impartiality isn't quite enough to get us started. I think Rawls considers an argument like this in, about section 10 of Theory of Justice, when he talks about the views of Lon Fuller. And just to expand on what he says there, or I think I'm expanding, I don't remember it all that well. But I think to expand on what he says there, in order for a view like Rawls's to get going or to get some purchase in society, there has to be some conception of freedom, the freedom and equality of citizens think. The idea that society ought to be a fair scheme of cooperation, that just a commitment to the rule of law itself won't be enough. But I suspect that a lot of the societies which we'd say they have rule of law also have many of these other democratic and liberal elements in the political culture, in virtue of which a view like Rawls's could get some purchase. Now, without knowing much at all about the political culture of Brazil or its democratic heritage, it's hard for me to say. But I gathered that you've had constitutional democracy here, since the late 70s, when the military was, the 80s. And there was a period before the military rule that was constitutional democracy, right? And so ideas of constitutional democracy are established here and it has some resonance. And the great interest that all of you have in Rawls suggests that the fundamentals of the view have some purchase, and I guess that gives me hope that you're not atypical, but rather that a view like this could find some resonance, despite, as you say, the great differences between some great differences between the U.S. and Brazil, whatever those may be. For example, and here's something I'd be interested in learning a good bit more about. Whatever the current place of the Catholic Church in Brazilian society, it must have left a heritage in the public culture that just isn't true in the U.S. in the U.S. was, to the extent that there's a religion in the public culture, it's low church Protestantism. But the political culture, because of our tradition of separation of church and state, the political culture is, there are not so many religious ideas present in it. I would guess that that's perhaps different here, but I'd really be interested in learning more about that. Let me just take up one more thing, and then we will throw the discussion open to the audience. And that is the couple of criticisms of liberalism that you mentioned that you say are misplaced, and I agree. One is that liberalism is inadequate because based on a view of humans as atomistic individuals, and another is that liberalism is just a tool to reproduce capitalism as an unfair system of production. And I think with respect to the first criticism, well, much depends on what's meant. But it seem to me that if you can get a vision of a society of mutual respect out of the social contract that Rawls begins with, if you can get something like the difference principle out of the premises that Rawls begins with, then instead of criticizing the premises, what you ought to do is celebrate the fact that the conclusions are so robust that you can even start from a social contract among persons just interested in primary goods and end up with what looks to me like a society that's so attractive and mutually respectful. And so I worry about the individualist criticism for that reason. And then we're in complete agreement about the claim that liberalism is just a theoretical tool to reduce capitalism as an unfair system of production. There no doubt are some versions of liberalism that are congenial to capitalism, even sort of predatory capitalism that we have in the US. But I don't think Rawlsian liberalism is one of those. And so liberalism is a big tent. There are lots of schools within it. And I think Rawlsian liberalism is at the far left end of the tent. And I think he'd be far to the left of anybody running for the presidency in the States at the moment. So I'll stop there and hear what people have to say, but this would be a nice chance for me to learn about the differences between political culture and economic and the economy in Brazil as opposed to the US.
Okay, so now let's.
I will have one question on this topic, maybe of the political values in Brazil. Also, here we see liberalism much more like with the freedom, relate liberalism with freedom. But when we quote Constant, I think that even in Constant, we don't have such defense of own freedom. Even in his famous discourse on unsigned liberty and modern liberty, he also is worried or concerned with education and the role of the state and the role of the citizen at the end of his famous discourse. So I don't know if he has such a strict defense of freedom or individual freedom. And I don't know, maybe also I think that what Rawls shows us that we can think of liberalism linked with equality. And I think that here in Brazil we have we have a lot of discussions on what is equality, what kind of maybe groups must receive the political policies for them, and what's the priority, what kind of groups, because we have the least advantages and we have women, we have racial discrimination that here in Brazil is always, we have a big problem here in Brazil on racial discrimination because there's some studies, some historical studies from sociologists that they said that it's like a myth in Brazil that we don't have racial discrimination here. It's like all the people get together here and they are all nice. And so you are trying to debunk this myth because we didn't have segregation laws. But, you know, like here, the policies have a big target. You know, they have like it's much easier to they kill black people. You know, yesterday we have a terrible scene. I don't know, like it's always like I don't know how it's a terrible event here because the policy just went to a party of teenagers, and they just got killed 9 teenagers. Like, and they got the movie, they got filmed, but you don't see the politicians saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," or the policy saying, "I'm sorry." It's just like, "Oh, it's just another thing," and you know, and you see some politicians just say, "Yeah, we have to defend the policies, especially the actual government." So I think that racial discrimination is a big problem, especially, and it's not sufficiently put in our political discourses, even in political theories. I think it's changing a little bit, but I think if I could say one of the high priority problems in Brazil, I think that this is.
Regarding with that, I would just like to comment and to ask you what your thoughts about, because I think that maybe after the Second World War, the equal status was something quite established. So we would disagree what is equality, what does it demand, the material circumstances, but I'm really, this is just a shot, but I think that the equal status was something established, and I'm feeling that we're kind of losing because of the polarization and stuff like that. I would like to, maybe that's something going on with that because we don't share that anymore. Maybe we don't feel that there's something to be said. And my feeling, my best guess is that it's due to polarization. And I would like to hear you a little bit about that because America has also been polarized recently. What are your thoughts and stuff like that? And you would like someone to talk about Brazil? You have someone to explain church and state and economics. I have someone in mind here. Let's see if he will say something about that. Can he? Oh, come on, please.
About
We wonder about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the state in Brazil. A little bit about the mode of production here. Like to wonder more about that?
Because and I was curious about the role of the church in Brazil because I suspect that the political culture is, in that respect, very different from the U.S., where we never had an established church, and where, to the extent that there was de facto establishment, it was low church Protestantism rather than Catholicism. So,
Can you please?
so I think that in Brazil, the church today has a different role, and so the history, the Catholic Church was one of the most important institutions of our political culture. Okay. There are 10 or 15 years that the Pentecostal Church, has raised, and today Pentecostal Church is one of the most important institutions of our political culture.
really?
Yeah. This is not a question of quantity, okay? In terms of quantity, Catholic Church still is the most important church of ours. But the intensity, okay, of the Neo-Pentecostal church plays a political role so stark,
Decisive,
first,
strong.
I'm sorry. So the Neo-Pentecostal church in Brazil today has a conception of society, a conception of world that is not compatible with the political liberalism. Okay? And this is a big problem.
And where is the incompatibility? Is it in women's issues? Is it that the church should get to dictate legislation of all kinds? How exactly does this work?
So, like the problem of racial discrimination, the question of the sexual orientation, okay, and even the problem of the social and economic distribution, because any discussion and debate about social distribution, although this is a socialist, this is communist, so it's not possible to discuss how can we distribute better the social record, the social resource. No, it's not a possible discussion, because this is a theme that just communists want to discuss. This is a big problem to us, and I think that it's so hard to deal with this. And so there's another point. A decade ago, we had something like a communal theology, a theology in which God is in the other person. Where is God? God is in the face of the other person. Today we had something like a sacramental theology. Where is God? God is in the sacrament. Sacrament. Okay? So God is up to us. And we can't ask if the suffering of the other is or not something that important. No. The religion is something that just had to do something that don't have anything to say about the social relation. And anybody that asks about this is not a liberal person, is not a democratic person, he's just a communist.
Interesting. And yet the critique that liberalism is unduly individualist is often comes from religious, at least in the States, comes from religious traditionalists. That these are the people who want to revive a kind of religion in which it's just about you and God and not about you and your neighbors. So there's a kind of irony there, a historic irony anyway. But that's very interesting. And you were telling me yesterday about the rise of the prosperity gospel here,
Yes.
and how important it is.
I just want to add some information. He's total right, but the Pentecostal, there isn't a Pentecostal church, but a Pentecostal movement and prosperity theology movement. But there are other Protestants that don't involve so much in politics, but there is a movement like the Netflix series like The Family that go to the president. The president said he made that statement that the next judge from the Supreme Court have to be
An evangelical.
terribly evangelical. So it's
More than evangelical.
yeah, it's not evangelical, it's terribly evangelical.
It's a kind of perfectionism.
Yeah.
A Christian perfectionism or
I don't know if this is a comprehensive doctrine acceptable.
yeah,
So I don't
exactly.
know if it
Because they are not
just
tolerant.
a perfectionist position.
Yeah,
It's a terrorist position.
yeah.
And does the Pentecostal movement make common cause with the Catholic Church, at least in abortion and gay marriage, or not? I mean, in the States for a while there was a sort of alliance between Catholics and evangelicals. What we mean by evangelicals on gay marriage and on abortion. An effort to keep both illegal. So there was some kind of political sympathy and cooperation, but I don't know if that has happened to you or not. Or if the Catholic Church is just not powerful enough to matter.
Non-abortion maybe, but gay marriage, I don't know if
They are much higher. The Catholic Church is much higher on politics than the neo-Pentecostal churches in Brazil. And I think that stems from, if you think about, for example, how the Catholic Church was a place of resistance during the military dictatorship, because there was a movement of bases. I think that's not the right word, but they were very communal.
Base
and,
communities.
yes, base communities, exactly. Grassroots movements in the church.
Liberation. Theology of liberation.
Yes, exactly, which was very strong during the military dictatorship.
Okay.
And during this idea, prevailed was the main, was the most powerful one actually, but it started, especially after the democratization, they started just leaving this space, the political space. The Catholic Church started to, it left a vacuum, a vacuum of power. And at the same time, these new Pentecostal churches emerged and they became more and more powerful. And I think that's exactly the difference. They have a political power project. They are organized in parties, political parties today. They dispute that in media. They have gigantic media, many channels. Yes, and
Radio stations.
they're not. It's much more a power project than a religious project nowadays. And I think that's also very problematic about what you were saying and how we do not recognize, we're losing the ability, the equality status or the ability to recognize others as our equals. And I think that's very strong in the idea of these churches, because they are based on the idea that that the faithful ones, they are more deserving, they are better because they live better lives, because their values are better. And that allows them to dehumanize people who are against it. And sometimes it kind of gives an excuse or something like that inside the morality of the religion. Something like it. So it's very much a movement that promotes dehumanization.
And is there a strong reaction against their presence in politics? Or do people think, religion's always been about part of politics here. It used to be that one, now it's this one. Right.
Depends on the people.
Depends on the people.
Yes. Our society is totally divided in terms of a lot of people, I'm gonna say, support this perspective in public sphere, and a lot of people don't support, and we don't have I'm gonna say majority in terms of agreement in terms of the public sphere. What is the public reason? What is not the public reason? Can we dispute
in the public sphere in terms of to normative, to regulate our behaviors.
Let me just keep track.
It sounds odd to our political culture or constitutional culture to say that a judge of the Supreme Court must be a religious man. It's not usual.
I'm sorry, it's not
It's shocking what the president said,
Yeah.
that a judge must be evangelical. It's not. It's not. It's not something with it we are familiar.
It shouldn't matter.
Yeah, it's new. It's new.
There's reaction to it.
It's now. Let me just keep on track with what Mariana said,
Sure.
because Denilson, which is a professor of philosophy from South Brazil, a friend of ours, he told me something that looks interesting and makes sense. He said that during this movement on the military dictatorship, that we had the Catholic Church, the theology of liberation, you had many social works of the Catholic Church. Then I'm not sure with which pope it made a difference that the social works were no more so important for the Catholic Church. Then, since we don't have a very good government programs on social assurance, then it looks like that was the spot, the market spot for the Neo-Pentecostal Church, because they do this existential program. So they've been reasoning ever since. So that's the Nelson's thought on the issue. I think it makes sort of sense, you know. And regarding the current issues, maybe we don't have this approximation of the Neo-Pentecostal churches with the Catholic Church, maybe because of the current pope. There seems to be some guy with different ideas from this ones that we've been telling you about the Neo-Pentecostal churches here.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the States, when there was cooperation, the high point of the cooperation between Catholics and evangelicals on conservative social issues was under John Paul, and there's much less of that.
Yeah.
Just one down, and there was also an important change in the Catholic Church from the theology of liberation from to charismatic renovation. Okay, and when the Catholic Church
To lose his neighbors.
Neo-Pentecostal come. Okay, and the Catholic Church has something like a tradition more stabilized about the relationship between church and politics. So we are church, you are politics. Okay, the Neo-Pentecostal, no. So there are mixture. There is a mixture between church and state that to them it's not a problem. Oh, state, church are the same thing. No. God is the owner of both. So they stay in the church. There's no problem about this.
There is a small wing of Catholic intellectuals in the States who are trying to champion a position like that, Catholic integralists, they're called. One of them is a law professor at Harvard. His name escapes me. Andre Vermoule. Who I think is one of the champions. And
on Twitter especially.
I can't even get on Twitter. But I was chatting about this with a friend of mine who's a very distinguished Catholic historian. He just said, "Have we learned nothing?"
Oh no, go ahead. A mixture about in economics. This movement picks up some libertarian postures, the small state, but in the questions about family and other morals, they want to make the state great, and prohibiting the speech of the professors in schools, and cutting financial to public universities. So it's very complicated.
There's a joke here, just to add, liberal in economics and conservative in morals, something like that.
Yeah, that's not libertarian, that's
It's
conservative.
Yeah, it's something. I don't know if it happens in the US, but it relates with our tradition and how liberalism was read here and implemented in the political realm. This mixture is.
Yes, because of this, we propose to change the subject a little bit, just answer your points. In this example, it's one reason that I have a commitment to defend the liberalism by the principle of the liberty. And I agree with you, since Constant and other liberal perspectives, we should discuss the equal and the social equal. But in this year, I published a paper that my main argument is the liberty is a necessary condition to have justice, to have democratic justice, but it's not a sufficient condition. And in that paper, I developed my argument in terms of to review the classical liberty, from classical liberty to Rawlsian liberty, and I tried to defend strongly the liberty in all sense, but I didn't, or I do not forget, and I don't want to forget the equal. But I believe each time in the public sphere especially, that we need to discuss, we need to point out the liberty as not just the first, but the principle, the most important principle to each, to we start the conversation, start to put our ideas. We can disagree. We can disagree because we have liberty. We can discuss a lot of point of view about liberty, equal freedom, the limits of the speech, etc. And I agree with you. I think it's so important to discuss equal and to put equal on the table at the same time. But nowadays I'm trying to put and to discuss the liberty because of this kind of example. I'm liberal on economics, but I'm conservative on moral behavior, etc. Oh, I'm sorry, you are not liberal. I said that you are not liberal. You don't understand what is a person, a liberal person, in terms of the individual and social context that we are living. Thank you.
Okay, so I think, thank you, Mr. Kamato. I think we could try to get another round. Whenever you think we could try another round?
No, I wouldn't mind a 5-minute break, but
Yeah.
we do another.
Yeah,
Sure.
so 5-minute break? Sure.
Or whatever people would like. Whatever people would do.
Okay, so we'll have a little break, okay?
Okay.
And then we come back. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you. We should ask the audience that they're doing most of the sitting. If they want another session, if
Ok,
they want a break, but I'm doing around for some more.
o que vocês acham? A gente vai fazer uma pausa de 5 minutos. A gente tem 3 pessoas para falar à tarde. A gente ainda tem mais 4 pessoas para falar hoje. Vocês acham que a gente já estica um pouquinho? Aí a gente vai almoçar para voltar com 3 da tarde? Melhor? Pode ser?
É.
Tá, então vamos fazer essa pausa de 5 minutos, tá? Precisa esticar as pernas, tá? Valeu, gente.
Ah, e tem uma lista de presença, quem quiser certificado, só preencher os dados ali, tá bom? Tá na foto.
Mas tem prioridade da liberdade sobre o princípio. Prioridade.
Não, faz
Vai falar em resposta a partir do prioridade da liberdade.
eu falei com ele ontem sobre espaço.
Agora vai
Eu acho que se
Fica muito quente.
aqui no Justiça da aposta tem liberdade.
Ele está com a cabeça boa. Mas tem um nome assim.
Acho que eu pus o nome do livro.
É? Isso é possível, cara, assim.
Da aposta?
Não sei se já é um objeto da sua pesquisa anterior ou se foi durante a escrita aqui.
Teve quinta-feira passada, né? Ação de graça, grande feriado. Black Friday?
Não, eu tava Black Friday. Isso eu gostei bastante. Eu trabalhei em faculdade particular. Realmente, só que lá no Chile, ela foi só atrás.
E aquela outra que você gostava ali, que eles escreveram bastante sobre a Marielle?
Foi ótimo. Não. Ficou. Aí na semana passada.
Eu acho que a família. Foi fundadora da cientista, a tua formação é
Já saiu das capas.
Direito acaba sendo direito
Porque eu tive aulas e elas ficaram assim,
e aí a faculdade é a faculdade de filosofia.
quando na verdade esse
a matéria
eu não sei se você sabe, porque você vive só o primeiro ano aqui. E eu não sei mais, eu
Sim,
mas eu tô muito
eu sei que uma só
tô com 2 anos
fez
pra
para
o conselho que eu ajudou é mesmo tempo que hoje em dia porque eu demorei para tentar
So we're going to start again. Eventually. Yeah. I get I'm Oh, I've got a full battery right now.
Thomas faz parte da nossa associação. Não, nós somos interesses um pouco distintos, né? Todas as diferenças. A tua faculdade é São Paulo capital ou
Não.
mas tu não é paulista? Ah, então, já é cidadão do Zé. Tu viu que está faltando no CPF?
Você pode também.
Eu não consigo nem entender. Não, entender. Eu fiz um esforço, eu errei. Mas chegar sabe, fazer São Paulo, todos. Ah, o mês passado, de vocês, não tem mais depois filiados. Isso aparece muito. Não, eu não posso.
Cada vez que eu saio de casa, eu chego aqui, eu passo na casa de uma vez.
A polícia. Desculpa isso.
Aqui.
Professor, uma grande greve também dos políticos, de talvez isso não ser
mais grave pode ser.
Não, eu acho que isso
é a outra polícia.
A ira fora
Polícia e polícia.
eles têm uma
Aí eles vão confundir, tá uma hora.
você pode seguir, eles dizem agora eu não posso seguir,
Pode ser.
é fácil com o motorista que não dá a seta.
eu não digo isso.
Nessa situação.
Não, você tem pedestre.
Eu vou descer, eu posso descer.
Agora o nosso meio é um pouco de pegação.
Ah, então
Então,
são as normas relações internacionais que faz parte. As normas gerais do país.
elas têm uma questão de flexibilidade da lei, continuar vigentes ainda que são nossos recursos. Isso que não é que ninguém vende.
Eu fiz a maior campanha para esse aproveitar. Acho que ele passou a vida toda em Santa Catarina.
You know that one?
Oh, okay. Because I
I read it. He's really exciting. And it's a good computer that takes up what egalitarianism and he's a very so that's how, and then there's another quote also by somebody at Harvard, Katrina Forrester, on anyway, it's about the emergence of the milieu approach, the context of which also emerges. And her argument is if there's well tailored to a particular set of circumstances, those circumstances now pass, and we should start thinking about something else. But it gives you a nice neighbor's recovery of this
source organization
Porque ele só ele está escutando. O pessoal ele essa parte que vai ficar mais
yeah, no, I'm not just I agree with I think Charles Taylor the product is yes, sir. Yeah, I think we got back on one.
Okay, so after a short break, we're back with Professor Marcos Fantón. Professor Fantón holds a bachelor's in law and social sciences, a master and PhD in philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. He is an adjunct professor at the Federal University of Santa Maria. He's also a permanent professor in the postgraduate program in philosophy at both the Federal Universities of Santa Maria and Pernambuco. This is way north and way south of Brazil, the national map. So currently he researches in the field of political philosophy with emphasis on contemporary liberal political theories. Professor Fantón, thank you very much for being here. I'd also like to thank your postgraduate program for funding your tickets to the luncheon. So thanks a lot, and please be comfortable.
Okay. I want to thank you, Franklin, for your kind invitation, and for all the students and professors that made this meeting possible. Suddenly, I just met all of you guys in a whole group studying theories of justice, and I'm very happy with this. I hope we can meet each other more often from now on. I also want to thank Professor Paul Whiteman for kindly reading our papers and being here discussing with us. My talk today relates specifically with a kind of systematic reading of Rawls' theory of justice. I will propose that justice as fairness could be read through the concept of point of view, and that at this first draft that I made here, we can distinguish analytically 4 different points of view. I'm not saying that these are all the points of view, that points of view that we can interpret in Rawls' theory, but this is an initial sketch of this reading. First of all, and so why I'm interested in this kind of interpretation. First of all, we need to remember one of the major roles of political philosophy, according to Rawls himself, to guide citizens' self-understanding about their political role within a democratic society, and the understanding of the main political values shared in public debates, such as equality, freedom, legitimacy, and tolerance. To achieve this, a political conception must meet 2 requirements: to specify principles of justice that identify reasonable and rational ends for all its citizens, and show that these ends can be expressed as a just and stable conception of society. Orientation in the conceptual space of ends requires a coherent and unified political conception, the final result of the exercise of reason. And thanks to Professor Paul Whiteman's work, White Political Liberalism, we have at hand a systematic and extremely clear interpretation of the unity of justice as fairness. Professor Whiteman's goal is to develop and defend an interpretation that unifies different partial readings of it. It must be sought through the concept of stability. By asking what Rawls means by stability and what 3 threats to stability he wanted to avert, we can unify the various perspectives on Rawls' work. And this is, I think, that one of the interesting points in Professor Whiteman's work. He tries to unify all these perspectives and readings of Rawls. Critics. Thus, Professor Whiteman's claim is that justice as fairness must be read as a just and stable political conception of justice for a free and plural democratic society. The process of justification of the original position involves then the identification of collectively rational terms of social population, and the demonstration of how, after the institutionalization and publicization of these terms, members of a just society would resolve tensions between the conception of justice and the demands of their own conceptions of good. The 2-stage model of the original position deepens and details the political ideals and values shared by the citizens of a democratic society and the demands of the promise of social control. As much as I agree with this reading, I think that maybe we could unify even more this view of the Rawlsian category. 2 main problems that we find in the literature can illustrate why we need a systematic reading, or why I'm still putting this problem. The problem of the compatibility between the first and the second stage of justice as fairness, and what Carla Bagnoli put as the starting point problem. Major trying to develop arguments for constructivism. The first one, I think Professor Whiteman clarified with his work, and I will not address it. The second one, I think we are still struggling with it, and I'm still reading and trying to find more arguments from Professor Paul Whiteman himself in his articles. I just selected one of these. The problem arises, as stated by different critics, from the suspicion that the original position and its justification only hold with the introduction of unjustified moral intuitions or moral principles. Professor Whiteman asserts appropriately that readings like Workings and Larmos, which grounds justice as fairness on an abstract principle of equal concern and respect, are misguided. Rawls sought to defend his theory on the basis of political conceptions such as society as a fair cooperative scheme and free and equal citizenship. Thus, says Professor Paul Whiteman, if we can speak of the foundation or foundations of justice studies at all, what is foundational to it are the conceptions of person and of society that are found in democratic culture and are made specific enough to generate political principles. This kind of interpretation as a conception-based view seems to presuppose two claims. And I don't know if I'm exactly right here, I hope so. The first one is that we achieved, as citizens of a modern democratic society, a consensus on the most important political values and conceptions that we as a society must strive to achieve, like equality, freedom, and justice. Nevertheless, we still do not have a refined and unified vision of these values or conceptions, especially in our public debates. The second, the description of this consensus and the other salient facts and political values relevant for the development of the theory of justice, like the fact of pluralism, public deliberation, person, citizen, society as a scheme of cooperation, hold as social practice or characteristics of it. Therefore, if we need moral elements to describe this practice, such as social cooperation among free and equal persons in democratic societies, it does not mean that we incur in an arbitrary move, but such elements are necessary for their proper understanding. We are, as once Rawls said, observers who seek to set out the structure of other people's moral conceptions and attitudes. I do not disagree with this interpretation of justice fairness. My concern here is understanding what is at stake when we describe or choose these foundations. How can we unify the foundations with the political theory itself? Is it part of the political theory? What is the theoretical status of these foundations? They are sociological factors, idealized conceptions, normative ideals, considered judgments, and so on. Is there a theoretical and methodological framework to develop or to select these foundations? I'd like to suggest then that the concept of point of view is paramount to approach this starting point of justice fairness. In Why Political Liberalism, Professor Whiteman describes with a rich detail the point of view of citizens in a society ordered by the principles of justice fairness. But the notion of point of view itself is not developed. Professor Whiteman states that point of view are given by desires, rules of reasoning, and information someone draws on when she makes decisions or renders judgments on the relevant kind. My proposal, therefore, is to rescue this brief insight and establish this concept as the organizing element of justice practice. To gain a real hermeneutical benefit from it, we need to unpack the complex structure of this concept and track its modifications throughout the presentation of justice practice. So I'm trying to make you two claims. Maybe this concept is really important, maybe to organize the justice as fairness, and the other one, so how can we read justice as fairness with this concept in mind? So where do we find the concept of point of view? Now, where Rawls describes it or gives some notation of this concept. I think there are three fundamental excerpts of Rawls' work. The first one is in Rawls' lectures on the history of political philosophy. I really enjoy this part. There, specifically in his lectures on law, Rawls sets out some maxims that guide him in the interpretation of classical political figures. One of these maxims reads as follows. I quote Rawls: to understand their works, then we must identify those points of view and how they shape the way the writer's questions are interpreted and discussed.
This observation refers to a remark made by the philosopher Collingwood that the history of political theory is made up of ever-changing problems and solutions. Rawls does not agree with this statement as a whole, limiting it to basic questions that we keep asking ourselves in political theory. But the interesting part comes right next. These questions may vary according to different points of view of the writers, their political and social worlds, and their circumstances and problems as they saw them, and not how we saw it. As recently called by Sharon Lloyd, this method of contextually situated and charitable interpretation must always take into account the point of view of the philosopher and presuppose his argumentative competence. Rawls demands then that we look for the answers different writers give to their, not our, question. I believe that this passage illustrates the importance Rawls gave to the idea of point of view, taking into account the philosophical problems and the social and political circumstances in which each philosopher lived was an important step to comprehend them. The definition of this idea follows roughly the strategy established at the beginning of the second part of the theory of justice. So I don't know if I'm correct, but I'm trying to connect these remarks on this notion. In paragraph 31, Rawls develops a hypothetical four-stage application in the original position of the principles of justice in the basic structure of a democratic society. Principles, once chosen in the original position, become an Archimedean point for a certain society and its institutions. The parties gradually change their point of view according to the different questions of political justice they face. And this is a kind of point that I'm trying to make. Rawls says, each stage is to represent an appropriate point of view from which certain kinds of questions are considered. Thus, for example, the choice of principles of justice requires the vials of ignorance to eliminate morally irrelevant information and or motivation. On the other hand, the formulation and choice of infra-constitutional legislation and public policies require some knowledge of contingent facts of a specific society. According to Rawls, in the quote, the flow of information is determined at its stage by what is required in order to apply these principles intelligently to the kind of question of justice at hand, while at the same time any knowledge that is likely to give rise to bias and distortion and to set men against one another is ruled out. In a later paragraph of A Theory of Justice, Rawls analyzes the expression good better than applied to the concept of rationality and formalizes the considerations made above. Something A is a good X in a first formulation, if and only if it has the properties that are rational for some person K to one in an F. However, this is not enough. Rawls observes, because the definition of such standards presupposes a similarity in the interests, capabilities, and circumstances of persons who want such an object. In this sense, it is necessary to add such variables which can be characterized as the point of view of each particular person and thereby relativize the criteria by which an object can be judged as excellent. And then I quote, I think that this is one of the major important excerpts. There always stands in the background a point of view from which an artifact, functional part, or role is being appraised, although, of course, this point of view need not be made explicit. This perspective is characterized by identifying the persons whose concerns are relevant for making the judgment and then by describing the interests they take in the object. I won't develop any further this point.
I just want to point basically this. I want to argue then that Rawls will assume the same conceptual framework to discuss political issues and develop a theory of justice. A person's point of view structures the framework for making a moral decision or making a political judgment. Justice as fairness, in the sense, pretends to establish an adequate and shared moral point of view for the evaluation of social, political, and economic institutions of modern democratic society. The addition of the principle of justice constructs the concept of moral goodness to the political realm. With this in mind, I propose a formal definition of the concept of point of view. And then this is what I'm mostly concerned of, if this can be, like, if we can claim this and if the structure of this concept is correct, right. We don't need to change. This, every point of view using justice fairness has a structure consisting of 4 components. The first one is the specification of a particular social practice and the problems that require an evaluative judgment. Second one, a description of the relevant social and political circumstances of this social practice, of the circumstances of justice, and what information is relevant and accessible to those involved in such practice. The identification of the practice's participants, persons, constructs, citizens, and the description of their interests and their relevant intellectual and moral capacities. A description of the appropriate mode of reflection and or deliberation of the participants for carrying out the evaluative judgment. One of the main assumptions made here is the complexity of the structure of justice fairness. I assume that Rawls' cathedral has 4 different points of view, complementary to each other, and which accumulate at each stage the results obtained in the previous one. To make this interpretation even clearer and easier to understand, I have created a table with the main points of view of justice fairness broken down briefly into their most relevant components. This is something that I'm developing. If my interpretation is right, I can make more effort than doing this kind of interpretation. So, thus, justice as fairness could or should be read as follows. The first point of view, here called Rawls' point of view, exhibit the process of description of a particular social practice and the process of modeling a deliberative procedure about particular problems of that practice. It is at this stage that we have the elaboration of the fundamental ideas that characterize justice as fairness. The ideas, for example, of society, free and equal person, original position, and so on. It is also here that we have the selection of provisional fixed points in the public culture, in the public political culture. In this case, the priority of the right over the good or the inviolability of the person. It is not here a subjective point of view. Right? I just want to make it clear. It's called Rawls' point of view because he's suggesting, but he's not. He did not took this off his own head. He observed this in the society. Moreover, this view can be characterized as intuitive and historical. It is historical because it established Rawls' interpretation of the social and political circumstances of the society in which he lived and which problems should be given priority. Thus, as we read their main theoretical works, we find the characterization of modern democratic societies and the persistent political problems that require philosophical reflection, such as the problems of distributive justice, mutual tolerance, and the relationship between the ideas of equality and freedom. Here I want to remember the role that we as political theorists must assume while developing a theory of justice. According to Rawls, one thinks of the moral theorist as an observer, so to speak, who seeks to set out the structure of other people's moral conceptions and attitudes. But in studying oneself, one must separate one's role as a moral theorist for one's role as someone who has a particular conception. In the former role, we are investigating an aspect of human psychology, the structure of our moral sensibility. In the latter, we are applying a moral conception, which we may regard, though not necessarily, as a correct theory about what is objectively right and wrong. It is also intuitive, as there is no specific decision procedure for selecting these fundamental ideas or the political values in the political culture. How, for example, do we decide that justice should take precedence over the efficiency or stability of a political conception? How do we decide that the original position is a better procedure than the Hobbesian state of nature? How the ideas of freedom and equality should be defined? Here Rawls admits that we have no method of selection. We need to choose those of the ideas and conceptions, I quote, that strike us as most promising. Rawls admits also the important and inevitable role of intuition in our theories of justice. As we can see, the results from Rawls' point of view are included and implemented in both points of view of the original position. I will not develop them in more detail here. As we can see in the table, I just fulfill the main components. Maybe there are some wrong choices or some misguided, but you can discuss this. Finally, the fourth point of view, listed in the table, is considered, I don't know, it's a good name, but an indexical point of view, so to speak. Define it as the point of view of you and me. Given the democratic conception of philosophy, Rawls addresses his conception of justice to any citizen who has an interest in reflecting on political issues in a rational manner. The focus here is on the search for coherence between our sense of justice, or our considered judgment, and the political conception we hold. It is a fact of political culture that we have conflicting political convictions, for we do not, in all cases, consider its practical consequences in depth or the conflict between different convictions we hold at the same time. The effort to achieve this harmonious conjoining is expressed through the method of reflective equilibrium. Thus, this later point of view expresses an adjustment activity between convictions and political conceptions, and it is the only point of view that interacts with all other points of view in an ordered way. This kind of relationship expresses the non-foundationalist characteristic of justice fairness, in which no specific condition or value could be considered as the only basis for public justification. I have characterized this point of view as indexical because it is always undetermined. It basically depends on the relationship between we, you and me, have with our considered judgments, our sense of justice, and the reflection we have made on which political conception is the most reasonable one for our society. In this sense, this point of view will always depend on the readers and the social and political circumstances in which they live. That is also why I decided to frame the first point of view as Rawls' point of view. It's like an expression, you and me, Rawls is talking to us. So Rawls is considering here the me in his own writings. He is offering us an understanding of our, or of his, own social and political circumstances. So my main intention in this paper was to offer a brief sketch of what a systematic reading of justice fairness would look like. I am not that concerned with the exact content of the points of view. Maybe they are a little bit messy, a little bit wrong, but what I'm most worried about is with this main proposal, maybe here, if there is, the idea of point of view is a great idea to organize and read justice experiments. And maybe it's a great idea to develop even further theories of justice. If it is correct, we may have some advantages. And just to conclude, The immediate gain from this proposal can be seen in the kind of understanding we have of Rawls on theory. This interpretation is first and foremost complete, or strives to be complete, because we can add the other points of view, the first day application of principle of justice. Secondly, it is structurally comprehensive, because in addition to allowing the differentiation of the stages, it allows determination of the main components of each stage, and thereby a conceptual and methodological control. And finally, it seeks to make clear the coherence of the theory by showing that the relationship between its components has no gaps or section relations. A second gain from the reading proposed here, which I would like to defend, comes from the analytical elaboration of Rawls' point of view. Through this resource, we gained greater clarity on how Rawls understood his social and political work, and what the main political problems and values caught his attention and received priority. However, it is up to us here and now to ask the same questions Rawls himself posed to modern contractualists. Is this the political world in which we live today? Are these the political problems and values that must receive priority in our political and social context? Is there currently a consensus in public political culture on certain political values? And then, the agreement of these questions seems to be decisive for the agreement of later theoretical developments. If, however, there is no consensus at all on these basic questions, it is now up to us to ask what kind of disagreement it is and whether there is still room for rational discussion between parties. Finally, one last gain is the capacity that this type of reading allows for the formation of maybe a research program. As some readers may have noticed, there is the absence of certain components or steps in my interpretation. For example, the four-stage sequence of application of the principles of justice was not detailed. The idea of public reason, which creates particular difficulties given the current discussions, is also missing. If the idea of point of view and the above presentation of justice fairness could help to reflect on such concepts and can be further developed, then I will have achieved my goal. Yeah? And as Rawls once said, utilitarianism has only become a consistent and widespread moral theory given its capacity for constant reformulation through the integrated work between different thinkers. Likewise, through his writings, Professor Paul Whiteman showed us how to strengthen and perfect arguments in favor of political liberalism, and especially in favor of justice fairness. I hope I could have engaged in a respectful and thoughtful manner upon his writings and offered a complementary reading of Rawls' material.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just say a couple of things. And the first is that the idea of a point of view is, I think, a very important one for Rawls, and maybe it became increasingly so as his work progressed from theory of justice through to later writings. You're quite right to find the notion of the point of view mentioned in his treatment of the good early in the third part of theory of justice. And the theory of the good, his treatment of the good, is fascinating in and of itself, and we could talk about why that's so. But quite apart from the intrinsic fascination, the talk about point of view is central to his treatment of the good, and it reveals a couple of things that are really, I think, important about the idea. So Rawls says, just to recapitulate what was said in the paper, that something is a good, well, one of his examples is a watch. Something's a good watch if it's got the properties that it's rational to want in a watch, given what watches are ordinarily used for. And in order to apply the definition, you have to think your way into the point of view of people who ordinarily use watches. You have to focus, and you have to focus on some information, what watches are ordinarily used for, and abstract away from other information about it, information that's irrelevant to its use. And so the ability to think one's way into the point of view of others, to focus on some information, to filter out or extract from others. All that's at work in the use of the idea of a point of view and the theory of goodness. And those features of the idea of a point of view are, I think, really important when we look at other places where the idea of a point of view occurs. So one of the remarkable things about us as a species is that our own activities, and indeed ourselves, we can be the objects of our own reflection. Our activities can be objects of reflection. We can adopt a point of view on ourselves and our activities. And we can zero in on some things that are important about ourselves, abstract away from other information about ourselves. You know, I don't know that any other species has an ability to reflect on itself or take a point of view on itself, but we are able to do that. And I think the ability to do that, to reflect on ourselves and on our position, on our place, and to abstract from some features and not others, is really important to some of Rawls's students, like Thomas Nagel and Christine Korsgaard. I think this ability to reflect on ourselves is central to their work, no doubt under Rawls's influence. It's really important to the construction of the original position, where we have to reflect on some of our capacities, isolate some that are most important, and abstract away from other information. And of course, it becomes extremely important in Rawls's middle period, when he starts to present his view as a form of constructivism. So roughly according to constructivism, the norms or rules by which we live are rules that are given by a procedure for constructing them out of certain basic ideas. The idea of free and equal persons, the idea of a fair scheme of cooperation, and a procedure of construction given by the original position. And the idea of having a view of ourselves, or a point of view on ourselves, having a conception of ourselves as free and equal, is really important to Rawls's constructivism. So for all of those reasons, I think you've hit on an idea that's really central to the development of his thought. And I'm glad you've done that, I'm glad you've highlighted it. I also think that the isolation or identification of Rawls's point of view, understood as the philosopher's point of view, the point of view that the philosopher himself had on certain philosophical problems and political and social problems. And I think identifying Rawls's point of view and looking into his context and the problems in which he was interested in is really important to understanding what Rawls is up to. And one of the exciting recent developments, I think, in political philosophy, or at least in Rawlsian political philosophy, has been the emergence of a generation of young people who are starting to do this, who are looking through the archives, treating Rawls as a figure who now belongs to history, and trying to recover what was going on in the period in which he wrote, what problems moved him, what he read, what he wrote but didn't publish. There are a couple of books that have come out recently. One, Eric Nelson's book on liberalism's religion, another Katrina Forster's book, in which they're trying very hard to recover Rawls's context. And there are a couple of more items in the works, books in the works, that I hope will come out before too long, that also plumb the Rawls archives and try to get at the philosopher's point of view. So you're quite right to identify that as an area of fruitful research too. Okay, on that note, I think I'll stop. We'll see what you have to say.
Yeah. So, some notes. So John, I know you said still work in progress. Do you have any thoughts that you could give us in advance about the relationship of the points with the four-stage sequence? Because that's what was the four-stage sequence of part studies. Yeah, if you have any, because I was thinking about that.
I was researching this, and what took me this motivation to do this work was Gerald Gall's work, The Tyranny of the Ideal, because he has the notion of political perspective, and Ryan Muldoon works on, I forgot the social contract, and I
can't remember.
But he also has a notion of political perspective, and
of course, Gauss and Moodle has a different point of view of liberalism. And I think that they put something interesting, that what happens when we disagree with our political conceptions, and this very basis, because Rawls talks on the society as a fair scheme, and in utilitarian society it's another kind of society, and another kind of person. But if we disagree at this stage, what is still room for a rational argumentation? Or what kind of disagreement are we doing this? Because once in the original position we put all the conceptions, but we already agreed with original position. What can we do if we don't, if we disagree with it? I'm really concerned with this. And the work on Gauss and Newton helped me to think more about this kind of problem, this kind of political disagreement.
Yeah, I know we'll get to Gauss later. I think it comes up in another paper. But one of the things that concerns me about him is that his point of view, the point of view of what he calls members of the public, is also an idealized point of view. But I don't see what the principles are for the idealization. I mean, in Rawls you get a Kantian story about why we have to abstract away from so much information, and as well as arguments about the moral irrelevance of the information that's being excluded. I mean, in Gauss, maybe I just haven't worked on it long enough, but I just don't see that there's any comparably powerful or even plausible rationale for the kind of information, for the kind of idealization that he engages in, or why he stops where he does.
Yeah. I think maybe model is the value of diversity, and we can discover new ways of life and more. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's been quite abstract from anything.
Yes. Yeah, because in Moodle we don't have abstraction. It's just we don't even agree with what we are disagreeing with.
Right.
It's like, okay, you think that the world has this object is like a fetus, and you think that this object is a bunch of cells. But okay, we need to find some point of agreement. But we won't need to discuss this object.
Yeah, there's not even agreement about this social intelligence.
Yes, the word. I don't know if it will work in the political realm, because he explicitly says that, okay, my theory is just an epistemological, epistemic conception. It's not a political conception. I don't know if it. So we still maybe don't have a normative conception of justice with this.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit more from you, Max. I realize that you are concerned with the problem of disagreement, but I'm still asking how do you intend to deal with the problem? What's the role of the notion of the point of view in order to deal with problems of disagreement?
Yeah, as I said, one of my major concerns reading Rawls was what are all those non-constructed elements. Like he explicitly says this, and we have in political liberalism a lot of facts and sociological facts and values that I don't know exactly, but it seems to me that he's trying to clarify what is a democratic society, what are the major values that we see that citizens hold, and the first point is this: make clear what is this foundation or this basis, because sometimes we are disagreeing with the original position or the principles of justice, but it's not exactly this kind of disagreement. We are disagreeing with the own concept of society, of persons. And so we can, with discussions, clarify even more what are we disagreeing with.
Okay.
And this is the first, one of the first points. The other is the structure of justice defense, and achieve more clarity maybe with the concepts and the internal coherence of the concepts, and maybe we can gain a real gain with Rawls, just not with the content, but with the methodological structure and the way that he develops his theory of justice. So maybe we can adjust just as Rawls did with his own theory. If we can just, because one of the other problems that I'm concerned with, that I was talking to Frankie yesterday, is with the recent developments in social psychology, with work of Heidegger and Joshua Green, with this discussion with Kohlberg's psychology. I really would like to hear you more from this also. You know, in my opinion, I think that Rawls read a lot of social and psychological development theories, and it is really important in the development of sense of justice. And I know what happens when we have new findings on social psychology, that we do not develop this kind of sense of justice, or there are debates even if we can have this kind of sense of justice. And so this is another point that I'm trying to feel. And this is why I think that the idea of disagreement, or how can we disagree without imposing power and other kinds of relations.
I would just follow up on the question about the relationship between the points of view in the four-stage sequence. And I guess the way I wanted to put my question is this: how are the various points of view related? So you might think in Rawls' own work that there's a systematic relation among the various points of view. So the point of view of the original position, people behind the veil of ignorance, I mean, very little. Then the various stages of implementation, the veil is raised and more information comes in. And so you can think of the stages as being sequentially related.
Yes.
More and more information in each part. And then the relationship, the point of view of citizens in the well-ordered society is one in which they all have full information. But in order to make his account of stability go, Rawls imagines that even they, at some point, can step back from some of what they know about themselves and just rely on the thin theory of the good. And so they, as it were, partition their knowledge of what they value, even though they've got full information. But that can be seen as part of the sequence too. And so we're just trying to figure out if there's some comparable systematic relation among the points of view that you distinguish.
Yeah, I think there is a systematic presentation, but when we try to make some corrections of justice parents, we are taking another role or another point of view with that is the reflective equilibrium, the point of view of, well, how does this point of view of the parties of the original position relates with my considered judgment? So when we try to see I don't know how they relate with each other, because one can argue that, oh, okay, so we can have 20 points of view in justice parents. I can add even more, like another argument, another different argument on others. I don't know if I have an answer to this argument, but I think that if the point here is always to see if it is a coherent conception, and so we don't need to see, okay, it is finished.
Yeah, so one thing you might say is that citizens in the well-ordered society who have full information have full information about theory of justice too. And so they can take the theory as an object of their reflection and ask whether it's in reflective equilibrium with their considered judgments. So that last bit that you were saying about reflective equilibrium and the point of view it demands could be fit in, I think, to the sequence. It's a point of view that citizens in a society can adopt.
I never thought about it, because I don't know, because I always thought that point of view of the reflective equilibrium is not part of the model itself.
Well, I think citizens of a well-ordered society have to ask themselves what justifies the theory under which they're living. And I think reflective equilibrium could well be the story of justification too.
This is a step of developing the sense of justice.
I'm sorry?
This is a step of developing the sense of justice, reaching reflective equilibrium. Yeah. I must agree with Justice's fairness. So the principles must be in accordance with my competing judgments.
Yeah, and so this is what you had in mind. So mature persons reaching an advanced stage of moral development are not just going automatically to affirm the principles or absorb them, but they're going to think about them and ask them how they fit.
Yeah.
And I would be interested to hear more about the developments in social psychology. I don't know much at all about that, but I have thought. Well, so I started reading Rawls long ago. I now have 2 daughters who are 19, but in watching them grow up, I thought, whether the whole story about moral development is right or not, the division into stages is right. That is, something happens at about 6 or 7. They quit parallel playing, and they do become able to play with others and think their way into others' points of view in a way that they couldn't before. And then something else does happen at about 13 or 14. And in fact, when I teach the stages of moral development to students, and this perhaps will only make sense at a Catholic university or in a Catholic country, I say the first stage is baptism to first communion, the second is first communion to confirmation, and then the last stage is confirmation on. So, although it has struck me when I watch them sitting texting each other that they went from parallel play to parallel play in 15 years, right? That they're parallel play when they're little, then they're interactive. Then they grow up and they get phones, and it's back to absorption of your devices and parallel playing.
Yeah, I would just like to push you a little bit further in that direction, Professor Lerchuk. You've already answered that because Iago really helped me to understand this part of the argument. So the stability argument has 2 major steps. One is the development of the sense of justice, then how that sense of justice will tilt in favor of the conception of justice, so how we live by the conception of justice. And it looks like that the first part of the development of the sense of justice was not abandoned by the later Rawls. And that seems like, according to Fantôme and following him, that really is based on Colbert. And it looks like Hyde is really presenting something different from Colbert, the development and the stages that you just described from your daughters. Do you have any readings or do you have interest in this development? Something like that happened?
You know, I haven't studied it all, so I don't know what he says. I know the name, but I don't know what his findings
The
are.
Righteous Mind
Which is my
is the book that he presents his findings, that basically, putting it very brief, we cannot have just one conception of justice in a society. We have what he calls a pluralism of moral matrix. So we have he puts morality as an evolutionary process. And according to everybody has like 4 triggers, he says. Like one is on charity, the other one is on liberty, the other is careness, charity, purity, authority, and
it's a work in progress. It's not saying we have this 5 moral foundations. It's what we have so far.
Yeah, and he made a questionnaire that he made with a lot of people on the internet, and he tried to correlate with different political positions.
Yeah.
So liberals has more, the triggers are more developed in, and and conservatives have, and he says, well, conservatives have really understood morality and they use morality in favor of them because they trigger all the triggers, you know, because they conjoin fairness with authority and purity and tradition, and the liberals are not like just like that, and they. So according to this questionnaires, we try to correlate this and see, well, maybe our society develops different kinds of moralities, and we cannot have just one. And then he develops also a kind of intuitive judgment. That says that all our political judgments are based on moral intuitions. And he has a metaphor that it's like an elephant, man in an elephant, not in a horse, because the intuitions and the emotions are so strong that we are not dealing with just a horse or something. It's an elephant because we cannot ride as we want these emotions. And so he tries to the big critics who roles are not exactly good because he just puts that Rawls and Habermas are very rationalists and says this kind of problem of the morality of Colbert. So he's attacking more Colbert and the other in Piaget than liberals or Rawls and Habermas. So, but we see a lot of discussion in this social psychology and how we can deal with this in political theories. So basically it's this.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. It sounds like stuff that I ought to know about. I would be really interested, if you all know about this, in what cross-cultural comparisons might show. It wouldn't surprise me, well, put it this way, if you conduct internet surveys in a country like ours, where it's deeply polarized, and where the polarization seems to track inequalities of wealth and inequalities of opportunity, it wouldn't surprise me that you get very diverse reactions.
Yeah, but this is one of the main findings he had, because he was trying to see what the first research was, where is the limit of morals? Like, and he said weird people, you know, the Western educated, industrialized, rich countries and developed countries. He said this kind of people always will draw the line of morality with the harm principle of Mill's harm principle. You know, I can do whatever I want without harming another person. And he, okay, but I need a very exotic country to do this research to see if I can have another answer. And he did it in Brazil. Brazil and in the US and another country, I don't remember what was that. And what he was trying to do, he researched children with health, with a good, with upper class and lower class, and did the same research in the US. I don't remember the city. And he found the same results between upper class and lower class. And it's kind of finding that he says that it's based on the kind of relationship that we have, the kind of education development. So there are one moral that will favor individual and the other will favor collective. And so the line of the morals is not drawn by nature. We have triggers, but we also have educational development. And this is one of the findings.
Well, it sounds really interesting. No, that's all I can say. I should familiarize myself with that. It sounds really interesting. I mean, it is hard to know what to make of real-world research, or the bearing of real-world research on a thesis that says people in a well-ordered society grow up under just institutions will develop in such and such a way. right? And so, but that may just be a Rawlsian thought. Well, that real world research doesn't really bear on how people growing up under just institutions would develop. But that's a little quick and easy, and we really need to get to know more about this.
One last question from Tom. It's just a suggestion. I'd like to see your thoughts on it. Don't you think that interpretive would be an interesting name for the lexical point of view? Interpretive. I don't know. It felt something like that. And I'd like to hear you say.
The idea of indexal is really because the indexicals literally, like it's to point to highlight the idea of you and me, like we are reading Rawls and we are also different, and we need to think if we are with these same ideas, if we have a consensus on these ideas, and thinking further, maybe what a person in 2013 will do if Rawls work, and how will you do it. I don't know, but it's a nice thing. I think about.
So, anyone else? Okay, thanks a lot for the presentation. From Tom again. So we'll have, 2 o'clock. I think it will be better for us to get back. We'll go to lunch, right? Thanks a lot. Obrigado, gente. Boa tarde.
Thank you. Okay, so we got 2 to what?
Yeah,
4?
so 2.
Sure. Yeah, 2 until 4:30 still. Whatever you want. Okay. Let's see how this discussion goes. Hello. Again.
Sorry.
Okay. All right.